Hey listeners, hope you're doing well. Before we begin, drop a comment with you're tuning in from and it is there. Kill the lights, put on your headphones, and let the night decide what you hear next. Where what time? Moths on the switchbacks. Good evening, Senor Williams and community of Carreteras de la Oscuridad. My name is Ruben. I drive a flatbed up and down the Sierra de Coahuila hauling steel beams. I'm writing because last month I heard an episode that mentioned a night convoy on a mountain road, and I felt my chest tighten. I had promised myself to forget what happened on the switchbacks between Arteaga and La Ciénaga, but silence has started to feel like carrying extra weight on every climb. Turn off the lights, and let me try to tell this as it lived inside my head. It was late October, almost Dia de Muertos. Cold air from the ridges smelled of pine pitch and damp earth. My cab heater clicked like a metronome while I crept past kilometer markers that always seem closer in daylight. The asphalt there is patched and shiny, the kind that grows slick with any mist. I'd been awake too long. Coffee made my stomach burn and my hands trembled at the wheel. I kept the radio low, just a murmur of northern ballads. When I rolled down the window a crack, I caught smoke not from my engine but something sweeter, like ocote and a thread of copal. The first sign was small, a pale shape rising from a ditch, fluttering like a handkerchief. It wasn't a handkerchief, it was a moth, large as my palm, batting against my windshield, then vanishing into the cone of the high beams. Another followed, and then another, until the glass seemed to breathe with white wings. I watched the temperature needle. The night fell a degree colder, frost nibbling the edges of the road. The curve they call La Vibora drops off to a canyon speckled with mesquite and boulders. On the outside shoulder, someone had arranged stones in careful spirals, each spiral pinned by a rusted nail hammered into the dirt. My headlights found them as the beam swung, and beyond them, on a turnout, stood a half-circle of figures. Shawls, tall hats made from some stiff fabric, not moving, not signaling, just there. Their faces pale or masked, it was hard to tell. The smell of copal was stronger. I told myself it was a velation and that I should mind my lane. I eased the truck into low and crawled, my trailer whining. That was when the radio cut. Not off, silent but alive, the backlit dial buzzing under my fingertips. The moths seemed to multiply in the beam, a blizzard. A shape lifted from the turnout, not walking but drifting step by step, shawl trailing as if underwater. In the rearview mirror, a second shape matched it, and then more, shifting into the road like patient shadows. I couldn't stop on that grade. The brake would lock, the load could slide. I rolled, slow as a man holding his breath. They stepped closer until one pressed a palm to my grill. It wasn't paint, but something dark and sticky that spread on the chrome. The cab filled with the smell of iron. I closed the window, but it didn't help. My mouth filled with the taste of a coin. I stared at the center line, kept the wheel straight, and recited out loud the names of my kids the way my father did on bad nights. The figures didn't look at me. They looked past me, over my cab to the canyon, as if measuring. Their heads turned in unison. At the next switchback, a torch bloomed to life. Orange light showed their hats were not hats at all, but frames with pinned wings. Moth wings, translucent, threaded together with twine. No one spoke. The only sound was my engine and a dry ticking like 100 fingernails against glass. On the far shoulder, someone had hung what I thought were talismans. Circles woven from twigs, feathers, claws, tiny bones strung on catgut. The wind made them click. A man in a black charro hat stood apart, still as a fence post. He lifted both hands as if to bless the canyon, and the torchlight shivered. Then the grate broke, the spiral ended, and the figures thinned behind me and were swallowed by the dark. I drove until Saltillo's yellow glow made my hands unclench. At a truck stop, I washed the grill. The smear didn't behave like blood, though it flaked like it when the water struck. It left a faint imprint the shape of a hand on the metal. 5 pale lines where the skin was pressed. I told myself I had dreamed most of it, that the moths were nothing. I parked in daytime and tried to sleep. The heater clicked and clicked. When I finally slept, I dreamed the canyon was full of white wings that formed a funnel like a waterspout, and at the bottom of the funnel something waited, patient as roadwork, for a signal. A week later, I took the route again at dawn. At La Vibora, I pulled over. The stone spirals were gone, scattered like kicked anthills. The rusted nails remained, dozens of them, black as teeth in the dirt. Above the drop-off, a fence post carried something newly nailed into it. The frame of a moth wing, stitched to a piece of fabric that looked very much like old shirt cloth, sweaty and stiff. I don't think they meant me harm. I think they measured. That handprint on my grill felt like the stamp you get at a bar, proof of entry you only see under the right light. Maybe the white wings are a way to call what lives on the canyon floor. Maybe the cult counts how many trucks pass, how many wheels, how many names whispered on the worst turns to feed that number into their spirals. I've stopped driving nights when frost is in the air. I make time, sleep more, drink less coffee. When I park in the yard, moths find my windshield even in the city and beat against it slowly, like a secret you promised to keep. Take care on those switchbacks. If you smell copal where there should be only diesel and pine, keep your eyes on the line and your mouth closed. Don't bring anything home that looks like a souvenir. That was my story. Let's keep listening to the next testimony. Salt on the Wind. Good evening, Senor Williams, and everyone in this community. I'm Alma from Puerto Angel, Oaxaca. I've listened to Relatos de la Noche for years while weaving nets, and when your podcast came up in my nephew's recommendations, I recognized the same quiet company in your voice. He told me to write this after I muttered at a roadside shrine, thinking I was alone. Please turn off the light and sit with me a moment. The sea is part of this even when it's not in view. I used to sell empanadas de camarón at the shoulder of the coastal highway, where the asphalt sweats and the mangroves breathe. People stop at the curve before Zippolite to stretch their legs and buy water. There's a shrine cut into the limestone there, a pocket of damp rock with candle soot combed up the ceiling. I never asked who it was for. That's how you stay in your lane. The offerings were always shells and small jars of salt, sometimes little shoes, sometimes a length of braided palm, still green. The day before the storm hit in late August, the air smelled like copper and tide. Pelicans dove clumsy in the distance, and the sun felt greasy on my skin. A bus pulled over, and then a pickup. 2 women in white blouses with heavy skirts stepped down, hair in long braids. The heat didn't touch them. They didn't look at my table or at the men sitting on their coolers, sweating. They carried a clay bowl and a bundle wrapped in cloth. You know how, when there's a wake, people move with a measured rhythm, slow but decided. That rhythm. I watched without staring. The older fishers didn't watch at all. They kept their faces down the way we do when the current under the surface is not one you want to name. The 2 women placed the bowl on the shrine floor. A smell of damp stone and something sweet rose up, not flowers, more like sugar that has been burned and then drowned. Wind came from the ocean without warning. It pushed against my chest as if a door had been opened. The candles in the niche didn't gutter. Their flames leaned left as if listening. A child stood up in the back of the pickup with an empty soda bottle and hit the roof with it in a rhythm, not singing, not talking, just striking. The 2 women lifted the cloth bundle. It was the size of a newborn. The younger woman had a tremor in her hands. She passed the bundle to the older one and they turned toward the mangroves, not toward the sea. I followed, I don't know why. The ground there is spongy. Your sandals sink and the smell of rot gets inside your throat. I stopped where the shade became heavy and watched them step between the roots. They found a place where the water was black as an eye. The older woman knelt. The younger fixed her braid behind her ear with her shoulder. They lowered the bundle into the water. It didn't splash. The surface accepted it as if it had been waiting. Something moved beneath, dark and slow. Bubbles rose. Not many. The older woman held the cloth a second longer and then let it go. The wind pressed, the kind that scrapes salt over your teeth. Behind me, the kid with the bottle kept tapping his rhythm until it matched the pulse in my ears. When the women came back, their faces were damp, not with tears. Their skirts left wet streaks on their legs. They did not look at me, but they left a small handful of white grains on the corner of my table, more a mark than a payment. My mouth felt dry. I didn't sell another empanada that hour. I told myself they had returned something to the water that belonged there. A body? An animal? You can rationalize anything in heat. That night the storm broke. The village smelled of torn leaves and flooded drains. In the morning, debris collected at the curve. People walked the shoulder picking through for usable wood, a crate, a tire. The shrine's candles were still lit. The limestone walls around them were beaded with moisture. Among the seaweed and plastic cups on the sand line near the mangroves, I found the cloth. It was torn open, and inside there was nothing a person could name without getting in trouble. Wreaths of braided palm, 3 small shells bound with a hair, and a bone that wasn't shaped like any animal bone I know. It was ringed and porous, pale as drift. When I bent closer, the smell of sugar drowned rose again with the rot, and in that same instant I felt a hand on the back of my neck. Not pushing, just claiming. The hand withdrew. On my nape, the skin prickled as if sunburned despite the clouds. I put the cloth back in the water with my foot and watched it settle. It vanished faster than it should have. When I looked up, 2 women stood at the road again, but not the same. Their skirts were dark. They held nothing. They looked at the sea and then at the shrine, and then they crossed the road without checking for cars. Vehicles slowed. People made space. In places like ours, we know when an act is not meant to be interrupted. After that day, fishermen who had never met began to leave jars of salt at the shrine. The glass fogged over in the heat as if breathing from within. No one said why. At dusk, I started hearing a tapping like a soda bottle against metal, even when the road was empty. Sometimes the tide leaves shoes again. Small ones. The laces are always tied. I no longer set up on days when the wind smells like a coin, or when the horizon has that white line you learn to respect. It took time to accept that their cult is older than our words and newer than our asphalt, and that it keeps the balance in ways I won't understand. If you pull over at that curve and you see jars fogged like sleepers, don't touch them. Don't take the shells, tie your laces, and keep moving. That was my story, and now we continue with another testimony. The Stone Choir of Milpa Alta. Good evening, Senor Williams, and greetings to everyone who listens in the dark. I'm Martin, a produce driver from Xochimilco. I run up to Milpa Alta at night for nopales and return before dawn when the city is quieter and the cobbles shine with damp. Your episode about a road that remembers set something off in me. I told my compadre at the Tianguis, and he crossed himself and told me to write, not to confess, but to unburden. Dim the room, and if you have one, light a small candle. This is about silence that learned how to stand. The road up is old stone patched with new asphalt. a spine that climbs through terraces and small brick houses. The scent is always a mix of wood smoke, coffee boiled long, and the damp of chinampas. Some nights, a bell from a small chapel rings when no mass is scheduled. That's normal, people say. Somebody practicing, wind, a hinge. The night I'm thinking of the air sat heavy on my chest. The radio lost its station and fell into static that felt like grit between the teeth. I passed a wall painted with saints whose eyes had flaked, giving them a second sideways stare. At a curve by a dry ravine, I saw the first figures. Not people, statues. A dozen, maybe, squat and pale as pumice, set in a semicircle on the shoulder. Each wore a smooth round hat, brimless, like a mushroom cap. Their hands were folded low, the way old women hold them in church. Someone had ringed them with purple popple picado that hung limp. Their faces were shallow depressions. No features. Just the hint of cheekbones and mouths sunk into the stone. I stopped because I'd never seen them there. I know every wall and roadside dog. I put my hazard lights on. The right blinker ticked in my ear. I got out with the flashlight you keep in the map pocket more from stubbornness than need. The statues weren't carved the way we decorate for fiestas. They looked old, not ancient like the pyramids, but older than any craft store. The surface wore the pocked texture of tufa rock from the ravine. Behind them, set into the slope, a door of rough boards leaned inward, secured with a chain. From behind that door came the smell of copal and something animal. I thought about calling someone. I thought of taking a photo. The beam of my flashlight trembled. In that narrow light, I saw tiny offerings placed at each statue's feet. Corn husks folded into birds, threads tied in loops, a small braid of hair, no coins, no plastic flowers. Someone had gone to trouble. Then a truck approached from behind. I stepped aside and waved. The driver slowed, rolled his window, but didn't look at me. His face was set in that hard line people wear when they have decided not to see. He crossed himself without lifting his hand and kept going. When his red lights vanished, the bell from the chapel hit one slow note, and the static on my dash rose as if it were answering. I got back in. The seat felt colder than it should have. In the mirror, I saw movement. Not of the statues, but of their shadows. They leaned as if pushed by a wind that did not touch the trees. The chain on the door behind them clicked. Not opened. Shifted, as if something behind it had shifted its weight from one foot to the other and then settled again. I drove on, because that's what I know how to do. At the farm stand, the old woman who weighs the nopales wouldn't take my money. She looked at my hands and told me to wash them with coffee grounds and salt when I got home. I laughed until I heard my laugh die like the end of a song on a scratched CD. On the way back, pre-dawn gray made the chapel paint look bruised. The statues were gone. The dirt showed scuff marks like knees, and the chain lay on the ground. The door stood open to a darkness that was not the absence of light, but a texture. And the bell rang 9 times. No priest, no congregation. Each note hung so long in the air that I could have counted the hairs on my arm lifting. The radio found a station on its own, and it was not music. It was the crowd sound of a church before Mass. Shuffling, benches, a cough, the soft thunder of many people making the sign of the cross together. No words. The longer I listened, the more certain I became that whatever gathered on that shoulder had learned how to wait by being carved into patience. I don't pass that curve without leaving something now. Not food. I braid 3 blades of grass and set them by the drainage rock. This is not faith, only respect. If you find a place in Milpa Alta where the road grows quiet and the air smells of copal, though no one is burning any, don't knock on any door leaned into a slope. Keep your eyes forward. Offer something small and be on your way. That was my story. Now, let's continue with another testimony. Static at mile 27. Good night, Senor Williams. Good night to everyone listening under your blankets or in their cabs. I'm Sergio, a long-haul driver crossing Chihuahua's straight lines where the desert makes you think mistakes. I almost didn't write you because there's no scene to tell, nothing dramatic, no apparition in a veil. But sometimes what you hear against your will is worse. I remembered your advice to tell it as simply as it was. Please turn off the cabin light and listen with me. There's a stretch near Jimenez where the road goes ruler straight, past scrub and wind towers that turn even when there is no wind. The air at night is the smell of hot metal slowing down, the ghost of rain that never falls, dust like flour. I keep the CB on channel 19 as a habit. Most nights it's dead, and I prefer it that way. That night, the green light showed signal when it should have been flat. At mile 27, a voice came through. Not a voice in the way you can imitate an accent or pin a region to it. Each syllable hit like a number set into a glass bottle. The words were in Spanish but stilted, square. They repeated the mile marker, then a series of numbers, then turn. I laughed because the road there offers nowhere to turn. Both sides are a low fence, and behind it land flat as a tortilla pan. I reached for the volume, and the knob clicked cold. My fingers felt like I had dipped them in a cooler. The repeat came again. The same, not bidirectional. I tried to answer anyway. Aquí ando, mile 27, no hay vuelta, I said, to fill the cab. The reply was silence and the sensation of something pressing the cab roof down like a hand. The truck lost a sliver of speed without my foot moving. Far ahead, two white lights appeared low to the ground. Not car lights. Handheld, the way ranchers use when they walk fence lines. They moved with no hurry. If they belonged to people, those people walked straight toward the road without stumbling once. I tapped the brake. The air brakes sighed and the sound seemed to be swallowed. The desert manages to swallow big sounds when it wants. The lights reached the fence and didn't stop. They slipped through as if the wire were water. My window fogged slightly, not like breath but like glass remembering a colder place. The radio clicked. A new set of numbers poured through. I didn't write them down. I wish I had. A second set, then the word turn again. I kept my wheel dead center. The lights split and took positions on either side of the lane, keeping pace with me like slow-running dogs. I couldn't see what held them. I could see the shapes of the lights against the brush and nothing else. I checked the speedometer. A fine tremor shook the needle even when the road was smooth. Ahead on the right, a service track did indeed peel away, narrow as a scar, hardly more than 2 ruts. I would never have seen it at that hour if the left-hand light hadn't tipped a fraction toward it like a nod. The radio repeated the mile marker. The smell in the cab changed. Not dust, not oil, old paper, a file left in a hot office. I said out loud that I was not turning. The sound of my voice came back thin. The left-hand light came closer, just within the edge of my headlight, and I saw the outline of a man holding it. He wore a brimmed hat that cast a shape where his face should be. His free hand was empty and open, a gesture I could read. There was no plea in it. He was not asking. He was showing. On the service track, in the narrow V of my headlamps, lay an arrangement of bones. Not animal skulls, not anything dramatic. Long bones bound with twine, clean and pale, spread in a lattice like the framework of a roof. They had been placed carefully. The track ran between them. If a truck drove over, weight would press and break. The kind of braking that means steeper things later. I kept straight. The man with the brim didn't move. The right-hand light swung once in a slow arc and then went out the way a breath goes out of you before you sleep. The left followed. The radio fell quiet. The cab stopped pushing down. My window cleared, as if someone had wiped it with the base of a palm. In daylight, on the way back, I watched for the service track. I saw it. The bones were gone. Only twine bits remained, caught in the grass like hair. Tire prints cut the track, wide and fresh, the kind made by a livestock truck. I didn't stop. I didn't want to put weight to any of those observations. That night, parked in a lit yard, I tuned the CB to 19 again. Dead. I turned past channels with the easy click and landed on a burst of crowd noise, like a radio in a church. It lasted 3 seconds and then was gone. I think some group uses the emptiest lanes where no one would question a strange vehicle at strange hours, and I think their numbers are not for us. The lights belong to them, or to something they serve. I can carry that without explaining it. If the radio tells you to turn in a place you cannot, stay your course. The road is safer than the track that looks like a shortcut. That was my story. Now, let's listen to another. Black Hat at the closed toll. Good evening, Senor Williams and everyone who keeps you company in the night. I'm Araceli. I used to run deliveries between Atlixco and Puebla. Flowers, mostly. Buckets of stems made the cab smell like wet leaves and iron from the shears. I stopped after the night the toll booth at San Martin was closed when it shouldn't have been. Your episode about coins that return with stains took me straight back. Please, if you can, sit with a small light and listen. Rain had just passed, the kind that polishes the asphalt and leaves a skin of water. The toll lights, usually green, were all dark. Barriers lifted. Cones arranged in a neat X. A handwritten sign on cardboard said Cerrado, and tilted with the draft of trucks slipping by slowly. Workers in orange vests stood under the canopy, their hoods up. Their faces were too shadowed to see. That's not rare. Nights put masks on everyone. I eased forward. A man stood where the attendant should be. Hat brim wide and flat. Coat like the long black charros wear without the silver. He didn't look at me. He looked at the lane beyond me, at the space I hadn't yet crossed, measuring. He raised his hand. I stopped. He didn't speak. He placed a small dish on the ledge where receipts stack, a saucer from a diner with a crack starbursting its glaze. He extended his other hand, palm up. I pulled 2 coins from the ashtray. They were already warm from the cab. He took them and set them on the saucer. He moved his fingers as a priest does over a chalice, but there was no prayer sound, only the drip from the canopy. When he pushed the saucer closer, the coins were white, coated in something that looked like ash but felt cold. He tipped his hat toward the far lane, a small motion, permission or instruction. I went through. The mirrors showed the workers in orange vests still, their heads cocked as if listening to something under the rain. On the other side, where lights return, everything was normal. Trucks paced. A bus passed, and the passengers' faces were blue in their screens. I drove to the first station, parked, and went to the restroom because that's what your body says even when your mind is elsewhere. Under fluorescent lights, I opened my hand. My palm had a ring where the saucer had sat, fine and chalky, and in the center 2 pale coins. They looked like Papo Moneda, a child makes for a game. I set them on the sink and washed the residue. The chalk didn't dissolve. It smeared, and the smear smelled like old incense and something medicinal. I wrapped the coins in paper towel and tucked them deep in my bag to deal with later. I didn't want to throw them in a trash can where someone could pick them up. The next morning, I took the bag into my kitchen. The coins had left rings on the towel as if sweating. I dropped them in a glass. The water turned to the color of cloudy tea and a faint sheen formed on top like oil. The coins remained pale. My son asked me if I'd changed laundry soaps because his shirts itched. The dog refused to drink from her bowl if it was near the glass. I drove to the toll again that evening in daylight to ask a friend who works weekends. He said the toll had never closed the night before, that they had been short-staffed, yes, but open. He looked at me like I was bringing him trouble. He pressed his lips and told me to throw the coins in a church poor box. I laughed and told him I wouldn't dump objects I didn't understand into a box where someone else would touch them. I took the coins to a small chapel near San Pedro Cholula, the one with the crumbling wall that smells of damp and flowers left too long. I left the glass on the back bench and sat. A woman up front prayed the rosary alone, her voice soft and quick. The moment I closed my eyes, I felt weight on my knees the way you feel it when a cat leaps up and settles. But there was no cat. There was only the feeling and a cold that spread, and for an instant a sensation like someone pressing a wide-brimmed hat against my forehead as if measuring. When I opened my eyes, the glass was clear. The coins were ordinary again, dulled but normal. I took them in my hand and their chill was gone. A ring of white remained on the bench slat for a second longer than it should have and then faded like breath on a mirror. I slipped the coins into the poor box because eventually we all compromise. Sometimes, in some lanes, there are collections that aren't for roads and wages. There are other budgets with other accounting. If you ever meet a man at a lane who keeps his eyes on the space beyond you, pass as he directs and don't argue terms. If any object feels like a stamp, keep it contained until you can set it down where the air is old and kind. That was my story. Moving on, let's hear the next one. The Burned Orchard Curve. Good night, Senor Williams, and everyone listening from kitchens and cabs. I'm Hector from Uruapan, Michoacan. I drive crates of avocados to the cold storage at night when the highway is emptier and the checkpoints don't take as long. I'm writing because I met a roadside fire that wasn't a fire and people who stared at it until it remembered their faces. If the room is dark, let it be darker. It was the dry season. Dust rippled on the shoulders in tan skirts. A smell of char came from the hills, even on days no smoke was visible. The ghost of slash and burn that lingers. Near the curve that passes an abandoned orchard, I saw a glow ahead. Not police, not a flare. This was orange, like the inside of an oven door. I thought of calling it in, then I saw figures spaced along the ditch, one every 2 trees, standing as still as stakes. Their faces were smeared black. Their clothes were plain. Each held something cupped. They were not warming their hands. They were feeding what burned. There was no crackle, no sound of wood. The flames roamed low among the fallen fruit like dogs nose deep in a scent. They licked without heat the way sun licks a river. I pulled into the emergency lane and kept my foot on the brake. The glow made the asphalt look wet when it wasn't. The fruit on the ground had blackened skins that split, showing flesh bright and obscene. The smell was sweet and wrong, like sugar burned to the point it tastes of blood. The people never looked at me. They sent their attention to the flames as a rope you can't see. One person broke from the line. A woman, her hair tucked under a cloth. She carried an old tin oil can with a rag stuffed in the mouth, but the rag did not burn. She tipped the can and a thread of liquid ran to the ground. Wherever it touched, the soil went dark. The flames gathered to it like a pet, pressing their faces to the earth. I realized my breathing had found their rhythm and I forced it back. On the far shoulder, a man stood with his back to the road. He wore a brimmed hat low and a coat too heavy for the night. He was there, and then he wasn't. I blinked and told myself, distance tricks you. The line of people shifted a fraction closer to the glow. They did not speak or sing. Their mouths were tight. One lifted a hand and pressed palm to mouth and then lowered it in a gesture I couldn't place. The flames hunched, like animals sleeping. A wind came down the hill, carrying ash that felt like baby powder on my arms. The cab filled with the scent of something old, catching fire after a long patience. I thought of my father's orchard and the years he stored the stub of a candle behind the meter, just in case. The woman with the oil can raised her head and looked between the trees to a spot I couldn't see. The flames followed her gaze. They seemed to pause, as if listening. A truck behind me honked once, only once, and the sound slid off the scene like a bead of water off wax. The driver sped up, eyes forward, hands tight. I shifted to move, but the brake felt heavy. In the glow, I saw on the asphalt small circles of soot like the bottoms of cups. The people had set something down and picked it up again and again until the pattern printed itself. I eased forward. No one stopped me. I passed close enough to see that the cupped items were not cups. They were small bundles of cloth tied with string. A few had split. Inside, I saw dark seeds, shiny and many. My skin crawled with a memory that wasn't mine. I thought of saints fed with kernels and of old women spitting seeds into their palms while muttering nothing. I did not look at the flames, and they did not look at me. The glow stayed on my neck like a hand until the curve ended. In my rear view, the hillside looked as before, a skeleton of branches and dry grass. When the cold storage man signed my manifest, I left a thumbprint of soot on the page, though I had not touched anything burned. 3 days later, a new orchard fence rose around the curve. The wood was fresh. A ribbon of cloth hung on one post, black as if it had been dipped in something. No one I asked knew who put the fence up. Sometimes, I think, they were feeding fire to the seeds themselves, so whatever grows remembers. I avoid that curve on nights when the smell of char sits on the tongue. If you see a glow that doesn't crackle, and people who don't warm their hands, keep your eyes on the white line and your mouth closed. That was my story. Let's keep going with another. The fog that collects names. Good evening, Senor Williams. To all who listen while they cross the Bajo, I'm Lydia from Salamanca. I drive a company pickup between plants, paperwork mostly, coffee in a thermos that tastes of metal and cinnamon. I hesitated to write because what I saw in the fog took nothing from me and still left me less. Turn the light down and sit close. On the road to Uriria before dawn, fog rests low like a herd. It carries the smell of canals and damp leather. The asphalt is rough there and throws small vibrations up through the seat like a cat purring. I was alone except for a bus far behind and a truck far ahead that blinked hazards every so often, the way people do when fog thickens into decision. At the lowest stretch, the fog folded over the road. Out of it, figures stepped with the care of people moving through a crowded room. They wore dark clothes soaked to the thigh. They were not looking for a car to flag down. They moved parallel to the lanes, hands at their sides, lips closed, their attention fixed on the ditch. I slowed, but did not stop. The pickup felt light, which is always the danger, that weightlessness that lets your tires skate. In the ditch, water stood black, flat as glass. People stood ankle deep. They were placing small objects on the surface and removing their hands quickly, as if not to disturb something sleeping. The objects did not sink. They stayed, each one turning slowly, a constellation of pale ovals. I understood with a ribbon of nausea that they were laminated cards with photos, the kind you clip to a lanyard when a job asks you to belong. There was no chant, no words. A woman lifted her card, pressed it to her own forehead, and set it down again, and another set of hands did the same. The fog tightened. My windshield fogged inside and out. I wiped with my sleeve, and my sleeve came away wet and cold. The radio, off, produced a line of static like a distant river. I recognized a face on one of the cards. He had been at a plant training, a man who asked for extra coffee and made a joke about the cups being too small. His card drifted past mine in the ditch as I idled. The photo looked upward with that dead passport gaze, and then the fog hit it and showed another and another. Some had no photos, only names typed in black strips. The people in the ditch did not cry. One shook with something like fever. Another pressed her fist to her sternum once, twice, then stopped. The bus behind me slowed. No one honked. That silence felt like respect or instruction. The truck ahead blinked hazards twice and moved on. I inched forward. Someone placed a card on my hood and lifted their hand. The card clung a second longer than gravity owed. The lamination pressed a ring of cold into the paint. I didn't remove it. When I hit a small bump, it slid, kissed the edge of the wiper, and fell without a sound. At the plant that morning, I smelled damp leather hours after I had dried my sleeves. In the ladies' room mirror, I saw fog fingerprinted on my cheek as if someone had pressed from the other side. The day passed in email and inventory. Names crossed my desk. Some of those names I'd seen in the ditch. Maybe it's always true that names gather somewhere to be counted. Maybe some people make sure the count is noticed. Maybe they stand where fog is thick and remind the water who to keep. I drive slower in fog now, slower than anyone has patience for. If you see laminated cards on a ditch and people setting them down with the care you use to put a baby to sleep, don't interrupt. The count might be all that holds something off. That was my story. Now, one last testimony for tonight. The Gravel Prayer. Good night, Senor Williams and Comunidad. I'm Mateo from San Luis Potosi, a mechanic who sometimes delivers parts when the courier can't. I write with grease still under my nails because the weight of this memory lives there. A friend shared your podcast in the shop. We listened after closing with the beer and the radio off. I remembered the night outside Villa de Arista when Gravel spoke without any mouth. The road there is narrow and lined with mesquite that scratch the paint if you wander. The sky throws more stars at you than a city person believes exist. Heat lingers even at midnight. My cab smelled of gasoline and the orange soap we use at the shop. The part on the passenger seat was a water pump wrapped in oily paper. I saw them first as a shifting pail at the edge of my high beams. A line of people stepping onto the road from a ranch track, each carrying a flat tray. The trays were covered in small stones like the ones you shovel out of a wash, round and smooth. The people set the trays down in the lane, not blocking it, arranging them with a precision that made the skin between my shoulders tighten. Their clothes were work clothes, but clean. Their faces were calm, like faces concentrating on embroidery. I braked and idled. I didn't want to crush the trays. The people did not wave or look at me. One man set his tray and then knelt, pressing both hands into the gravel until the stones nestled into his palms, then lifted them. His hands left prints on the tray that looked like hollows, and he moved on. A woman pressed her cheek to the stones, stood, and set her tray further along. No words. A rhythm formed, set, press, lift, move, and in it a shape emerged the way letters emerge from tiles. With the lights down, I could read it. Not a word I could say aloud. A shape made of old runnels and riverbed curves. A shape taught to the fingers before mouths. It was a prayer or a map, or both. The tray edges touched without overlap. A field of grayscale. My tires ticked against one tray and I flinched like I had kicked a sleeping dog. I reversed an inch. Far to my right, under the mesquite, a darker shape stood. Hat, coat. He turned his head, and I felt the movement in my jaw, like a yawn trying to open. He did not step forward. He did not lift a hand. He simply oriented. The people's work matched that orientation. In the beam's edge, I saw a dead snake laid in a neat S on one tray's rim and a child's marble pressed into the center of another. When they finished, the trays made a road over the road, pale and deliberate. The last person placed theirs at the very edge of my tire, fingers steady. Then everyone stepped back to the ranch track and stood. No one looked at anyone else. The silence had a low-frequency hum that my ears didn't hear, but my chest did. My foot lifted from the brake without my permission. The truck rolled forward. The stones did not crunch. They flexed and accepted the weight and then sprang back as if water under a boat. I crossed the field at 5 kilometers an hour, eyes fixed on the shape the tiles made. On the other side, the mesquite opened to a place where the air felt new. The truck breathed easier, I swear it did, and the water pump on the seat stopped ticking. I did not look back. I kept the speed low until the town lights began and the smell of damp concrete replaced the warm dust. The next day, I asked an old man at the shop if anyone still lays prayers in stone. He said some families do when the year turns bad and the cattle cough. He didn't ask me where I'd seen it because he knew the only right answer is on the road. I think their map directs weight where it must go to keep the rest from tilting. If you meet an extra road made on top of your road, cross it as if stepping on a neighbor's floor, careful and grateful. Don't speak, let your tires learn their letters. Take care out there and don't go looking for shortcuts that weren't laid for you. The Curve at Milpa Alta. Good evening, Senor Williams and community. My name is Daniel. I'm a baker from San Gregorio Atlapulco, and I drive a small pickup up the rural roads of Milpa Alta before dawn to deliver bread to tienditas. I'm writing because a friend from the Mercado told me about your podcast and said I'd find people who might understand why I don't take the same curve anymore. Turn off the lights and let me tell this as cleanly as I can. Those hills smell like cold earth and damp wood at 4 a.m. Even in the dark, you can feel the red volcanic dust cling to your shoes, the way it clings to memory. My routine was always the same. Load the conchas, still sweating steam, check the radio on the dashboard. An old battery one that only catches church broadcasts some mornings. And ease up the narrow road that passes a low stone wall in the Magway field where fog sits like the second crop. I don't drink. I don't get high. The worst vice I carry is coffee so strong it tastes like metal on the tongue. I say this because everything I'm about to tell you feels like it needs a defense. I've tried to give it one. I can't. The Curve sits under 3 Oyamelis. If you know, you know. The asphalt there goes slick with pine needles and mist, and the roadside shrine with candle stub is always wet to the touch. The week this started, there had been processions. Drumming in the afternoons, copal in the evenings, women carrying flowers down the slope. At home, my wife's hands smelled of onions and lard from the tlayudas, and our daughter kept a school project, 3 paper crosses on the dining table. Life felt busy and clean. I thought of bills, a dental appointment I kept postponing. The cracked rearview mirror I told myself wasn't urgent. The first sign was small. I took that curve and felt the pickup squat, like someone climbed into the bed. It's an old truck. It complains in new languages each month, so I told myself it was the load shifting. But the red nylon straps on the bread crates were tight, and through the rear window I saw nothing moving. Still, the truck carried itself differently, like a hand on its back. On the second morning, the dome light blinked on half a second as I entered the curve and went off just as quickly. There was no door open, no switch bumped by my knee. The air changed. Warmer at my right ear, cooler along my left forearm. The radio, which had been whispering a sermon from who knows where, fuzzed and settled into the low chant of a rosary. Santa Maria. Not words, not really. More the shape of them, as if remembered by a throat that had forgotten speech. I kept driving. I told myself the brain invents company at that hour. I delivered to the first tienda, wooden counter, floor of uneven cement, the owner already sweeping with the door half open to the fog. Behind me, the truck creaked as if someone shifted their weight. I turned and saw the bed empty, dew beading on the black plastic liner. A ring of dryness sat in the middle, perfectly round and darker than the rest, as if a warm thing had rested there. On the third morning, I brought a thermos of coffee and drank it without tasting it. I turned off the dashboard radio and listened to the truck. Fan belt whine, a pebble caught in the tire tread that clicked at slow speed, the whir of the heater trying to push away the wet. In the curve, the passenger seatbelt warning flashed once. I don't have a passenger seat sensor, my model's too old for that, but the little red icon blinked anyway. A single heartbeat of red on black, then darkness. Something like incense and wet wool reached me, the exact smell of the church when I was 8, standing next to my mother while she mouthed prayers she didn't quite believe. I spoke then, not to the thing, to myself. Keep it moving. I pressed the accelerator and the truck hesitated. Not the engine, but the body, then let go. At the top of the hill, I parked under a paper lantern left from the procession. I got out. My breath made white smoke. The bed was empty and wet except for 2 faint hand marks on the inner wall, as if someone had braced themselves there. They were not child small. They were not exactly adult either. The prints were made of dryness against dew, and they warmed my fingers when I placed my palm over one. After that, sleep grew dishonest. I'd lie down and feel my weight as a lie, like a badly told story. I started waking at 2 to check the truck, to make sure the crates were stacked tight, to touch the belts, to smell the cabin. The smell came and went. Copal braided with laundry soap, with the iron scent of damp coins. By the 5th morning, I couldn't pretend it was the truck. The curve pressed against me like a familiar shoulder. The dome light winked, the weight settled. The radio went dead. What I fear most isn't what it was. It's what it wanted me to remember. The round dryness, the handprints, the scent. These gestures. Someone rode with me to the top of the hill 3 times in a row, never showing a face, never asking, never giving anything but a presence that grew heavier each day. I thought of the shrine. I thought of a crash, maybe, a procession for someone who didn't make it, a night I slept while others didn't. And I thought of my own daughter's paper crosses on the table and felt, no other word, guilty. On the 7th morning, I stopped before the curve. I cut the engine. The hill was silent, except for a dog down in the fields, one cautious bark every 10 seconds. I got out, boots on wet pavement, and walked the short distance to the shrine. 3 candles blown out and filmed over with dew. A laminated photo long since bleached blank. I reached into my jacket pocket and found nothing I'd meant to bring. No lighter, no candle. Only a piece of bread wrapped in napkin for my own breakfast. I left it there. When I turned back, the truck's passenger seatbelt hung twisted, as if someone had just unfastened it in a hurry and let it fall. I had not touched it that morning. I had not had a passenger. I sat down, hands shaking, and the interior light stayed on longer than usual, revealing a small oval on the fogged windshield at eye level, clear among the breath frost. It was the clean shape a face leaves when it leans close to the glass. I've rerouted since then, adding 20 minutes to avoid that slope. Our daughter's paper crosses moved from the table to the wall. Some mornings, the old radio catches a hymn and I switch it off. I don't know who, and I won't invent it. It felt like a request, but wordless, and I failed it in some simple way, too slow, too frightened, too wrapped in my own routine to understand. The handprints are gone from the bed, washed out by a hard rain. The feeling isn't. That's my account, If you take that curve, keep your weight steady on the wheel. If something climbs in, don't ask questions you won't know how to answer. That was my story. Let's keep listening. The boy on the causeway. Good night, Senor Williams and community. I'm Arturo from San Andres Tuxtla, Veracruz. I drive seafood at night from the fishing camps near Santa Camapan to a couple of restaurants in Catemaco. I decided to write after hearing a story on your show about someone who picked up a silent passenger. Mine was also silent, and I don't have a clean explanation for why my seat was wet with salt when the air was dry. Turn down your lights and let me tell it in one piece. The lagoon smells like brine and mud when the tide sighs in. Nets slap against wooden posts, and the row of pangas creak like old men. Those were my nights. Iced coolers in the pickup bed. A radio of plastic crackling with norteños. A thermos that tasted faintly of gasoline no matter how much I washed it. My wife used to say the road made me thin in the face. I liked the quiet. I liked the way the night narrowed the world to my headlights and a strip of road. It was late, close to 3, when I turned onto the causeway that crosses the mangroves. A warm wind came off the water and dragged a plastic bag along the asphalt until it snagged on a reflector. In my high beams, I saw a boy walking along the edge, barefoot, a shirt of cheap cotton clinging to him. I slowed. There's a rule at that hour. You help if you can do it without being stupid. I pulled alongside and leaned across to pop the lock. I didn't see his face clearly before he climbed in, quick and obedient, like someone used to getting in and out of cars that weren't his. "Where are you going?" I asked, out of habit. He looked forward, head slightly down, water dripping from the ends of his hair onto his shirt. He did not answer. He didn't even shrug. He folded his hands in his lap and watched the road as if I weren't there at all. I told myself he might be in shock. I told myself he might be mute or scared or worse, high. But the truck didn't smell like glue or smoke. It smelled like salt and a sweetness beneath it, like crushed leaves when you rub them between finger and thumb. The seat beneath him darkened. Drops gathered on the plastic floor mat at his feet and slid toward the door. I turned down the radio until the speaker dissolved into a whisper. In that whisper, a choir flickered, something between a hymn and a broken signal. The wind pushed against the cab and the truck leaned. We passed a shrine with ribbons bleached white by sun and salt. The boy raised his head then, just slightly, like the dog you don't own that still knows the sound of your car. I told myself I'd drop him at the next light where there's an Alcas XO and a camera that sees everything. When I reached the light, it was red. I braked gently, afraid to spook him. Headlights from the other side erased the cab and made our faces into dark ovals. I turned to tell him I'd get him water, to ask him for a name I'd never remember out loud, and saw only my own seatbelt, twisted and laying flat across an empty seat. The floor mat was wet. The seat was soaked. Someone had been there and hadn't opened the door to leave. The red turned green and I rolled through because that's what you do when you don't know what you just saw. You keep in motion and let velocity pretend to be thought. I parked in front of the store anyway and got out fast, as if speed could force the world back into one piece. A man with a mop looked at me through the glass. The night guard in his orange vest smoked and turned away out of politeness. In the bed, ice fog rolled up from the coolers. In the cab, the wet stayed wet, and my breath fogged the window again, this time quoting the oval shape of a head leaning where no head leaned. I bought a bottle of water and a candle with the Virgin on the label. I have never been extremely devout, but you collect habits. I set the candle on the seat and it slid in a circle, leaving a dry arc through the wet. You can tell yourself a lot of lies about physics when you need to. I drove back to the causeway the next evening earlier than usual. I told my wife there had been a delay. I wasn't sure what I meant by delay. I parked before the bridge where a handful of roadside altars gather like little houses. Offerings smell like sugar and wax there, and the mangroves hiss when the wind shifts. On the concrete lip of the bridge, someone had left children's shoes, cheap plastic sandals, blue and warped from the sun. The left one had a name written inside in marker, already bleeding into illegible loops. The right had no writing at all. There was a newspaper clipping under glass, water-stained and bubbled. I didn't need to read it to know the story. Fishing family, a sudden squall, a small boat too heavy with net and stubbornness. The dates never matter, except to the ones left. A plastic flower rattled against the concrete in the wind. Even with the humidity, even with my shirt sticking to my back and the mosquitoes at my wrists, I felt cold along my scalp, the deep kind that makes you want to take off your hat and press your palm there. Since that night, my passenger seat takes a long time to dry, even on days when I carry no one. Sometimes it smells like the lagoon when the tide is low and the heat lifts salt into the air. Sometimes it smells like the inside of a church on Sunday. I still drive. The restaurants don't keep themselves supplied and the sun rises whether I sleep or not. But now, I say the name written inside that left sandal before I cross the causeway. Not because I think he'll hear, not because I want to summon anything, but because names belong in mouths, and silence is never an answer. If you drive that road at night, don't ignore the little houses of candles. You won't owe less for pretending they aren't there. That's my testimony. And now we can move on to another voice. The Brecha of the Sierra. My name is Isabel from Arteaga, Coahuila. I work as a forestry engineer. Most of my nights are documents and maps. But some weeks I'm on the mountain roads, heat in the day, and a cold that bites your knuckles at dawn. I never believed stories about presences. I thought the mind made shadows grow teeth. Then I camped alone on a brecha and learned how loud the invisible can be. If you're listening in the dark, let's keep it that way. The Sierra smells like resin and dust after noon, and like wet stone before sunrise. That week, we were surveying damage from illegal cuts. I stayed late to finish a transect and decided to sleep in the truck rather than drift down to Saltillo half asleep. The brecha was narrow, cut into a slope of loose rock with a grove of oyamelids to one side and a dry arroyo to the other. Wind moves differently up there, broad and slow, like an animal taking its time to lie down. I wasn't afraid. I'd slept alone before. I had tortillas with salt, a thermos of café de olla, a radio that caught nothing but a ranchera that seemed to start in the middle each time I turned the dial. I folded down the seat and arranged my jacket as a pillow. Coyotes sang a while and the pines whispered like fabric between fingers. The truck rocked gently when I shifted, and for a few minutes I felt like a child on a swing. At some point, the air changed. There's a small wind that steps out from behind a tree when something steps with it. That's the best way I can say it. There was no sound of feet, only the certainty that the space just outside the passenger door had gained weight. The radio hissed and went to silence. The cabin cooled quickly at my neck. Resin smell gave way to the odor of damp wool and coins. I kept still. The older I get, the more I value stillness as an answer. The truck made a brief plastic pop as something small in the dashboard adjusted to temperature. Then the passenger seat sank a finger's width. The fabric tightened as if a hand had pressed down, then released. I stared at the ceiling fabric like a penitent. A gust moved the treetops and pine needles tapped the windshield with soft insistence. I whispered, "Wakien," because stupidity disguises itself as curiosity. No voice answered, nothing did, but the seatbelt on the passenger side unspooled a little, the buckle turning on itself as if brushed by a knee. I had the thought, absurd and precise, that whoever it was had just settled a backpack on the floorboard. I reminded myself of facts. There had been deaths on these slopes. A fallen worker last year, a truck overturned at a curve 2 years before, empty vodka bottles near the creek where kids celebrate too hard. Grief hangs. But this did not feel like grief. It felt like attention. A presence leaner than memory, more deliberate than wind, patient. I sat up, slow, and poured coffee. The smell lifted and layered with the damp wool. My breath made a thin cloud. I set the cup in the holder between the seats and it warmed my fingers. I took a sip and burned my tongue, which made me feel stupid and alive. The weight on the passenger seat eased, almost polite, then returned. The metal zipper tab on my backpack began to sway lightly, as if someone had tapped it with the back of a knuckle. A Censero rang in the distance down in the rancho, then another, lazy and off time. I pictured a cow moving in its sleep. Then a sound like fingers sliding over denim, a quick pull, and let go. The passenger visor flipped down 1/2 inch, not enough to fall, just enough to declare itself. I could smell a hint of copal, impossible at that altitude at that hour, carried not by wind but by decision. I spoke again, not to it but to myself. "Duermo," I said, and lay back. Cowardice can look like discipline. My heart made a small fist in my chest and then opened again. The seat rose. The buckle settled. The air warmed by a fraction, like someone stepping outside to smoke. The coyotes called from the ridge, an argument and a love song at once, and in that noise the presence left, not walking, not fading, simply ceasing to pressure the world. At first light, I stepped out. The ground was damp with night, and the dust held 3 partial ovals on my passenger side where no human shoe could have stood without sliding down the slope. They were not footprints. They were places where dew hadn't formed. I put my hand over one and felt a remaining cool there, the exact temperature of a coin you've held between finger and thumb for a long time. I drove down slow. The radio found its middle again, the same song starting without an opening. Back home, the house smelled like tortillas warming and the rose soap my mother uses for everything. I said nothing because I don't know the verb for it. For weeks after, I would wake and feel a weight on the edge of the bed just at my knees, the suggestion of someone polite enough to wait until I acknowledged them before pressing further. I did not acknowledge. It did not press. If you ever sleep alone on a mountain road and something sits where no one is, do not ask. Leave room on the seat. Keep your coffee close. The Sierra keeps its own ledgers. That's my report. And now we continue with another testimony. The vanishing at La Rumorosa. Good evening, Senor Williams, and greetings to everyone who listens on long drives. I'm Raul from Mexicali. I haul produce to Tijuana and back, and I've been listening to you for a year to keep my head straight on the descent from La Rumorosa. I've been holding this in for months. Someone disappeared in front of me. I have nothing wise to say about it. Turn off your light if you want the truth to sound louder. It was September, hot even at night. The rocks on the ridge hold heat like a grudge, and the wind there never stops talking. I'd fueled at La Cuesta and started the descent, the trailer humming behind me, the brakes a careful conversation rather than a fight. My partner that week was a kid named Esteban, riding shotgun to learn the route. He made me think of my nephew. Same restless leg, same habit of staring too long at nothing as if he could will it to confess. We'd been arguing softly about music. He liked trap. I told him to save it for flatlands. A line of red taillights floated ahead, brakes sparking on curves. We rolled our windows down and the air smelled like hot rubber and dust, with the ghost of pine somewhere above. Esteban leaned his head out and whooped like a fool, and I laughed because that's what he was. He took a video for his girlfriend, narrating in a fake, deep voice, and then the signal dropped and the screen froze, capturing his open mouth and the smear of lights. Past the concrete lookout with the mangled fence, there's a pull-off I use to give the brakes a breather. We took it. That's where it happened. I checked the drums with handheld thermometer, a thing I've become religious about since a bad year a decade ago, and Esteban hopped down with a bottle of water. The wind hit in a steady, muscular way, like the push of a crowd. Below us, the desert stretched out. A flat, dark sheet with a few cold stars pinned to it. The hum of the highway never turned off. He walked toward the low wall at the edge of the pull-off, the one stained by oil and candy wrappers stuck like prayer flags. I remember the angle of his shoulders. I remember thinking he stood like a boy at the beach, toes curled over the wet line of sand. He raised the bottle to his mouth, then lowered it. He turned his head to the right as if someone there had touched his sleeve. I didn't see anyone. I didn't hear anything different from the wind. He took a half step forward, not onto the drop, but toward it, and paused, his weight balanced in that small place where you can still choose to step back. I opened my mouth to say his name. I didn't get it out. The world hiccuped, not in vision, not in sound. In presence. In the way a room feels when someone leaves it, and you notice the leaving in your skin before you notice it with your eyes. Esteban was no longer standing there. The bottle rolled in a small circle at the base of the wall and came to rest against my boot. My throat closed like I'd swallowed smoke. I jumped the low wall out of reflex, a stupid one. There's a slope there and then nothing. I landed on my heels in gravel and slid half a meter, grabbing at a scrub that ripped my palm. I shouted his name. The wind shouted back every name it had ever held. Headlights passed on the road above and painted the rocks white for a breath. No figure moved. No scuff marks pointed down. The gravel where he had stood kept its shape, a smooth, wind-slicked surface like the back of a river stone. I called the highway emergency line with hands that didn't seem attached to me. The operator's voice was too calm. A patrol car came and then another. We spent hours with flashlights whose beams looked like teeth in the dust. A drone flew and gathered footage only a committee would ever see. A rescue crew went lower than I'd thought possible. They found old beer cans, a crushed toy truck, a sun-bleached jacket stuck on a thorn like a forgotten flag. They did not find him. The official paper used words like accidental fall because the world needs paperwork. I signed where they told me to sign. I went home and looked at my wife's face and wished she had a different husband's story to listen to. Sometimes she sleeps with the light on and doesn't know she's doing it. Back at the pull-off a week later, because I can be cruel to myself, I found a small rectangle of dry on the otherwise damp morning wall. Dew everywhere except that clean print. It was the size of a phone laid flat. It took my breath not because of what it was, but because of what it wasn't. It wasn't his phone. That had been taken with the rest. It wasn't a hand. It was absence made geometry. A place where night had refused to touch. Now, whenever I pass that spot, I feel a press at my right shoulder, then at my left calf, as if someone is easing by me in a crowded aisle, careful not to spill what they're carrying. The seatbelt on the passenger side sometimes vibrates against the door for a second, like a string plucked by a cautious finger. I talk to the empty seat and tell it the grades and the tight curves as if I were teaching again. It calms me, or it calms it, I don't know which. If you stop at La Rumorosa at night, don't lean where the wind seems to invite you. Don't trust the space around your body to stay put. That was my account. And now continue with the next one. The Shrines of Mil Candelas. Buenas noches. Señor Williams y Comunidad. I'm Mariela, originally from Oaxaca, but living in Puebla, and I sell coffee and tamales from a cart I push along the road that runs past the cemetery of Mil Candelas before dawn. A cousin sent me one of your episodes about people who work nights and keep their fear folded small. I've never written a thing, but I want this out of my mouth. If you're listening, lower the light and stay with me. The cemetery is old and damp, like a mouth that never quite dries. The stone is slippery with algae on the shaded side, and the smell at that hour is a braid. Wet earth, stale flowers, the sweet iron of blood that only I seem to catch when it rains. My cart has a radio wired to a battery. It plays whatever the air will give it. A misa murmured from a far parish, a cumbia with a broken backbeat, 2 stations arguing without knowing. I park in the pull-off where mourners leave candles. The wax crust is thick there, built year over year into bright, uneven terraces. I light my burners. Steam smells like cinnamon and metal. Delivery drivers, graveyard shift nurses, an old man who sweeps leaves. The regulars take their cups and go with quiet thanks. When the wind hits from the east, the votive flames bend their heads together like people telling a secret. The night it began, a little before 5, my breath made fog, and the fog hung low over the graves. I heard the tiny clatter of something settling on my cart shelf and turned, expecting to find a coin someone had dropped. There was nothing. I wiped my hands on my apron, and the apron smelled faintly of copal from the night before, stubborn as grief. When I looked back, the ceramic sugar bowl had moved half a hand's width to the left. I don't have a good reason to say this matters. Things move, but it was the way it moved, as if someone had put a fingertip to it and gently nudged it to make a space. A nurse came, eyes rimmed red, hair pinned too tight, and ordered café de olla. "Sin mucho azúcar," she said, and then pretended not to cry when the steam hit her. While I poured, the lighter I keep by the burners clicked once against the metal edge of the cart and fell. It didn't simply fall. It had been set upright and then tipped. I picked it up and felt it warm, as if a hand had held it a moment before mine. I've learned the shapes of people who are there without announcing themselves. The weight of a stare lives on the skin like humidity. A minute later, the wicks on the votives near me lowered their flames, then lifted them, as if a breath had passed among them. Not a wind, something with the precision of a person. The second night, the same bowl moved the same distance. The sugar inside glowed faintly in the candlelight, like tiny bones. The radio struggled through a hymn, lost it, and landed on static that carried the rhythm of whispered prayers without any word I could identify. The temperature dropped at my arms, but not at my hands, which stayed hot over the pot. A cup I had set mouth down on the cart roof rolled, stopped, and rolled back to its first place. I watched it with the detached fascination of someone watching their own hand shake. I started speaking to the air, not politely, not rudely, just to mark that the air and I were sharing the same world. "Dejam vendor," I said under my breath. "I'm working. If you want sugar, take it." That last line made me laugh a little. The sound came out wrong, thin and bent. Behind me, where the vigil candles climbed the cement, a narrow strip stayed dark and dry amid the liquid glow, the same shape every time, as if something slender stood there and refused flame and dew alike. On the third night, a young man came with a bouquet, all gladiolas, stems wrapped in newspaper, the ink bleeding. He set them on the steps by the western gate, touched the iron, and didn't cross. He took a coffee black. "Do you ever feel watched here?" he asked, attempting casual and landing on afraid. "At work," I said, "at home, in my own body. Some days." He nodded, as if I'd answered his real question. He left. When I turned back to the cart, the sugar bowl had a small fingertip pressed against its rim in sweetness. A single dent in the mound. Not mine. People tell stories about children in cemeteries, about women who sing in voices too quiet to hear. This wasn't a child. This wasn't a singer. This was someone who stood just beside the candles and moved tiny things to make a tiny order, to take what sweetness was left. The night after, I understood that, understood as generous, accepted as closer. I brought a second bowl. I placed it 2 hand widths farther left than the first. I set the lighter between them, upright. I turned to stir the pot and felt the lighter go down in the soft plastic click that, by then, meant company. I finished stirring and did not turn back fast. When I did, the first bowl had moved half a hand to the left again, almost touching the second. I smiled without meaning to. The air around my forearms warmed, the feeling you get when someone stands close enough to share breath on a cold morning. The radio found the end of the hymn it had been chasing and gave me 5 clear notes that rose like a small staircase before losing themselves to static again. People thought I had an assistant for a few weeks. 2 cups appeared when I only set out 1. Napkins refilled themselves. A spoon moved to where a hand would reach without looking. I won't say I felt safer. I felt seen, which is not the same thing. These nights, when I close, the candles gutter, and the wax holds shapes of little rivers. Among them, there is always one thin, dry channel the wax avoids. I don't step there. I don't set anything there. I leave a sugar bowl within reach of the space and go home. If you work near the dead, leave room around you. Some presences don't take, they arrange. Don't ask them to explain. That's my story, and now we continue. The milpa that wouldn't let me pass, Yucatan Lux. Good evening, Senor Williams and community of Carreteras de la Oscuridad. My name is Jorge. I'm a roadworks foreman from Merida, and I send this because I heard a story on your podcast about small guardians in the fields and felt something loosen in my throat. I've carried this around for 2 years. Tonight, I'm parked on the shoulder outside Max Canu, engine off, windows down, listening to the cicadas. If you can, turn off your light and come with me. I need to set it down once and for all. Back then, we were carving a rural bypass that skirted a patchwork of milpas and low, stony scrub. If you've driven out here, you know the smell. Wet limestone, burned stubble, and old copal that seems to cling to the skin even when there's no smoke. There was a ceiba near kilometer marker 47, massive, roots like sleeping animals. The elders from a nearby comunidad stopped by our site trailer the first day. They weren't angry, just careful. They asked that we avoid that ceiba and the little piles of stones someone kept arranging at the edge of the path. Son casas, one man said. Little houses. We marked the tree with spray paint to protect it and joked about tiny neighbors. The jokes didn't last. The first sign was our tape measures. I left 2 on the hood of the pickup while I checked a line with my assistant, Cesar. When I came back, there was only 1, and the second lay upright 20 meters into the brush, balanced against a rock like a wand left to dry. No footprints, just the sharp smell of fresh earth turned by something small. That week, odd things accumulated like dust. Wooden stakes hammered flush would work themselves free by morning and lean in tidy bundles at the base of the ceiba. A chalk line would lead straight, and then, when you turned your back and walked to the pickup for the plumb bob, it would kink itself 2 handspans to the left. We blamed wind, boys from the village, even Caesar, who loved a prank. He swore it wasn't him. I didn't believe him then. I started having a sensation I can't dress up for you. It was like walking into a kitchen where someone has just stopped speaking. You know the silence, I mean, held but not empty. The hair on my arms would lift and I'd smell damp stone, like the inside of a well. I'd look around and see the little piles of stones, 4, 5 at a time, arranged with a care that equaled ours. The men got jumpy. Coffee tasted metallic. Radios fizzed with a child's laugh that wasn't there when you rewound. At home, my wife asked if I was sleeping at all. "You look chewed." I told her about the ceiba. She said to take honey and a small bread roll to the tree. My abuela did that when she planted chiles. It felt superstitious to me, but I needed the crew calm. We went before first light, when the cicadas held their breath. I set the roll at the base of the tree and drizzled honey over it. The sweetness felt wrong out there, thick and shining on the roots, but the air eased. We went back to work. The line held that day. Stakes stayed put. An ordinary shift, until dusk. We were wrapping cables when Caesar called me to the pickup. On the hood, in the fine film of dust, there were small handprints. Not a child's, exactly. The fingers were short, the palms narrow. The nails sharp enough to leave half-moons where they pressed. Beside them, a little spiral drawn with a fingertip, tight and perfect, like a snail's shell. "Who did that?" I asked, already knowing I would get only shrugs. The men took a step back without meaning to. It was then I noticed the kilometer marker. We had passed 47 every day, white post with black lettering, half tilted in the scrub. At that moment, it wasn't where it should be. It stood on the opposite side of the cut, facing a direction where there was no road, as if it had turned to watch us. I walked to it, and there in the dirt at its base were prints, the same size as on the hood, stepping lightly around the post. We finished under a sky that went from copper to bruise. I told the night guard, a cousin of mine, to keep the generator on until 10 and then kill it. He nodded, pulled on a sweater against the cold that creeps in here when the sun drops, and I left in the pickup. I took the narrow lane that parallels the main highway, trees brushing the doors, dust licking the tires. The radio gave me rancheras, and then, cutting across a chorus, the same bright child's laugh, very clear, as if it were in the back seat. I didn't look at the rear view. If you've worked outside long enough, you learn which glances cost you more than they give. But I felt the air shift, the way it does when a small body moves in a tight space. And then, something tapped the glass behind my right ear. Just a nail, once, precise. I gripped the wheel and tried to think of nothing. A smell came up, green and cool. Chaya leaves torn with thumbnail and wet stone. When the lane opened and the lights of Makanu showed like smoldering coals, the smell dropped away. I parked by my house and sat a while, my hands buzzing like I'd been operating the jackhammer. At 3:11 a.m., I remember because the display on my microwave was the only light. The front door clicked. It was locked. I checked things 3 times lately, but I heard the bolt lift and the door ease open until the night pressed in, full of moth dust and the faint sugar of street guavas. My dog, Tigre, didn't growl. He climbed under the bed and trembled. The door never moved beyond that first deliberate inch. We lay there until dawn, my wife's hand on my shoulder. The next evening, I brought more honey, a little clay dish of atoll, and a child's marble I found in the street, a cat's eye, green and gold. I set them at the roots and said aloud, "We're leaving the ceiba. We'll curve the road. We're just trying to pass." The foreman in me hated how that sounded. The man in me felt right saying it. We adjusted the line and lost a day. It saved us a week. Work smoothed out. Stakes stayed true. The chalk snapped the way it should. The guard said the generator now ran clean. I stopped hearing the laugh. On our last afternoon there, we drove the pickup along the fresh bed to check the compacting. I braked by kilometer 47, out of habit more than need, and looked at the post. It was back where it belonged, stubborn and a little crooked. On the hood near the windshield wiper, someone had left the cat's eye marble. I had set it at the kiba and never returned for it. Now it lay winking at me in the heat. I still have it. It sits on the windowsill in my kitchen, where the breeze smells like mangoes when the neighbors are making jam. Sometimes it turns a little. like it feels the mood of the room. A thing can be silly and true at the same time. That's what I learned out there. If you ever work along those milpas, don't cut through a ceiba if you don't have to. Bring honey. Leave something small. And if you hear laughter behind you that feels lighter than it should, don't turn right away. Let it pass like a cool hand on your neck. That was my account. Let's keep listening. The Detour by Los Tuxtlas, Veracruz, Cheneques. Good night, Senor Williams, and everyone on Carreteras de la Oscuridad. I'm Raquel, 39. I haul poultry and dry goods up and down Highway 180 between Veracruz and Quitamaco. I send this because a listener from Minatitlan described getting lost on a familiar road, and every word jabbed me with a thorn I've carried in my heel since last rainy season. Turn off your lights and hold the wheel with me. I'll keep it as straight as I can. It was the kind of downpour the Gulf cooks up when the mountains gather their skirts. The air was warm and tight, and the windshield wipers worked like they were swatting birds. I had the smell of chickens, wet feathers, and ammonia, soaked hay, and there was a radio whisper through the cab. A talk show from San Andres Tuxtla faded in and out when the hills swallowed the signal. I like that stretch, even in bad weather. The road glides between green that never stops and patches of mist that pool in the hollows. You feel the rubber on the wet asphalt, and the tension in your hands gets replaced by attention, if that makes sense. A sign warned of a temporary detour ahead. A painted arrow, a line of orange drums glossy with rain, and tire ruts sliding into a narrow rutted lane that slipped under trees heavy with water. I'd taken detours like that 100 times. You follow the tracks and thank God for good shocks. I downshifted, felt the load settle, and followed the curve. 200 meters in, I knew I'd made a mistake I couldn't name. The rain softened the edges of everything until the trees looked like they were leaning, tired of being trees. The lane narrowed, the mud took my tires with a greed that felt personal. On the right, I saw a little mound of stones with a few leaves tucked between them, wet and dark, set just off the rut as if someone didn't want the water to sweep them away. I put my hand to the horn to warn anything around the bend but didn't press it. The noise inside the cab changed. The engine didn't fail, the radio didn't die. What happened was that the space around me stopped holding sound the way it should. It got thick, as if I were driving underwater. My grandmother would say that's how they come. She was from a small place near Santiago Tuxtla and told me stories about Cheneques, small ones who mind the old paths. Oh, she always warned me, if you ever go into their places by mistake, don't yell, don't insult, and if you feel turned around, switch something you're wearing inside out. They don't keep you if you look like you're already wrong, she'd say, folding her apron with cracked fingers that smelled of lime and lard. I didn't remember that advice until later. The lane led to a half-collapsed culvert where a creek mumbled over stones. I stopped because I had to. The rain tapped the roof and then stopped tapping and hissed instead, sheets slanting, leaves letting go cold water in bunches. I put the truck in neutral and let it idle. The odor changed, wet fern, clay, and the sweet rot of fallen fruit. I couldn't see another vehicle's taillights. I couldn't see the highway, the drums, the painted arrow, the workers. Nothing. On the other side of the culvert, something moved. Low, quick, deliberate. I didn't see a face. What I saw was a small foot pressed briefly into the mud and lifted again, toes spread, heel barely touching, as if whoever it belonged to didn't need to push off the way we do. I told myself it was a Coatimundi. I told myself a lot of names as if names were breaks. Hey, I said, not to the thing, to the rain, to the day. Hey! It felt like a swear. The sound hit the windshield and fell back into my lap. I thought of backing up and found I couldn't remember how far I'd come or how tight the bends were. I thought of stepping out to see if the culvert would hold the weight and my hands wouldn't let go of the wheel. Then something small thumped the side of the cab, low. Not a branch, a knuckle. I didn't look. I was so afraid to look that my body invented reasons to keep my eyes forward. My skin felt wrong on me. My heart went like I was sprinting, though I hadn't moved in a minute or a year. I remembered my grandmother. I grabbed my baseball cap and turned it inside out with fumbling fingers. It was such a stupid gesture that the stupidity felt like prayer. The second I did it, the rain changed. It sounded like rain again, not air being ironed. A bird skittered from branch to branch. Far off, a truck blared a horn, and that ordinary complaint came to me like someone calling my name. I put the truck in reverse, eased back, hand shaking, whispering sorry without choosing the word. I think I repeated it to the trees, to the creek, to whatever watched from beneath the low leaves. When I reached the highway, the arrow wasn't there. The drums weren't there. I sat a long time with the hazard lights ticking off little squares of courage. A pickup slowed alongside and a man leaned out, his hair plastered to his forehead. "You good?" he asked. I nodded and then laughed, the ugly kind. "All good," I said. "Road's closed up there." He looked at me like I'd conked my head. At my delivery in Catemaco, I stepped down from the cab and found my left boot full of mud up to the ankle, though the cab floor was clean. When I lifted my foot, a leaf stuck to my heel. I peeled it off and my hand smelled like a crumbling altar, damp, green, and older than any road. Later, in the diner, I went to the bathroom and caught my reflection. My shirt was on inside out. I hadn't done that with my hands. I don't know when it changed. I drove back the next day under high pale sky. No detour, no culvert, just the road with its smooth curve and a line of black vultures on a fence wire, their feathers like wet paper. I slowed by the place where I thought I'd turned and saw a small pile of stones in the ditch. On top of it lay a bottle cap and a twist of red thread. I left a coin there, 10 pesos, the sun face up. A small thing, maybe not enough. I don't know the scale of these negotiations. Since then, I don't ignore the little mounds, the child hand altars. If I see them near a path, I don't take the path. If I must, I say I'm passing and leave a sweet. That night taught me that not all arrows are for us, that some roads belong to others who don't need signs. If you feel the air go thick and the rain stops sounding like rain, make yourself wrong and get out. And never ever call someone hey when you don't know their name. That was my account. Now, let's move to the next testimony. The Braid in the Fog, Puebla Highlands House Duende. Buenas noches, Senor Williams and the listening community. I'm Alma, 31, a nurse on rotating nights between Zacatlan and Chinahuapan. I'm not a trucker, but my life is paved by the same roads and the same hours. I chose to write after hearing a woman from Hidalgo mention waking up with her hair braided. The way she said it made my stomach go cold. If you can, turn the light down and breathe with me. I'll take you along the shoulder I know too well. Night shifts change the body's math. You live on coffee and broth, and the skin of your face takes on a different tired. The smell of the hospital stays on you. Bleach that didn't kill everything. Latex, the soft fat scent of formula in the nursery. The sweet iron of blood. That night, the fog came down hard over the highlands, the kind that makes orange street lamps float like saints and slicks the cobbles until your shoes aren't yours. I ended at 3, changed, and caught the last collectivo halfway to my village. It broke down at a curve where the pines lean close, as if they're minding a secret. The driver swore at the carburetor and then looked at the fog like it owed him money. "I'm not walking it," he said. "I'll wait." I said I'd go. It's a straight kilometer to the turnoff. I've done it in boots and flats and once barefoot when a heel snapped. I tucked my hair into my coat and started, bag on my shoulder, the cold slicing my nose, the world condensed to a wet circle around my feet. I swear to you, fog has footfalls. You hear your own, and then you hear a second set that pretend to be yours by slipping a half beat behind. The first time, I felt that I laughed out loud because the alternative was stopping. I didn't stop. On the right, the ditch gurgled. On the left, the slope dropped away to orchards that smelled of damp leaves and the sour sweet of fallen apples going to cider by themselves. I passed the little roadside cross where a boy died on a motorbike 2 summers ago. Someone had left a thermos cup there still warm. That detail kept me breathing. At the turnoff, I felt the relief you feel when a light you'd forgotten about clicks on. The fog thinned. The gravel under my feet changed sound. That was when something tugged my hair once, sharp enough to sting. A single quick yank from the level of my shoulder, as if a small hand had hooked a finger under a lock and tested it. I spun and told the fog I'd had enough, that exact foolish phrase, "I've had enough," and my voice hit wool and returned to my teeth. I ran the rest, keys out, coat open, the damp biting through to my back. Inside, I locked the door, leaned my forehead against it, and laughed again. The ugly laugh that comes when fear gets embarrassed. My aunt, who sleeps like a saint and snores like a mule, lifted her head from the couch. "You scared me," she said. "You look like you walked through a laundry line." I went to the bathroom, turned on the harsh light, and took off my coat. My hair, which I'd tucked away, lay in a braid I had not put there. Not a salon braid, not neat, but a tight, childish plait, damp and smelling of fog and resin, tied at the end with a twist of thread I didn't own. My scalp hurt in 2 places where the braid began, as if small thumbs had pressed hard to keep the hair still. I undid it with trembling fingers. I didn't cry. I didn't want to give whatever did it the satisfaction of a sound. Over the next week, things shifted a half inch to the left. A spool of suturing silk I'd smuggled home to practice knots went missing and reappeared balanced on the window latch. The salt cellar was full of sugar. My aunt's rosary tangled itself around the brass knob of the bedroom door like a joke someone intended to be tender and got wrong. Then came the stones. 3 little ones on my kitchen table, arranged from smallest to largest, wet as if a child had licked them. That night, I heard a tapping in the cupboard. Low, regular, 2 taps and a pause. 2 taps and a pause, like a polite request. At the hospital, I told a cleaner named Don Lupe. He is the kind of old that looks like a gnarled root and smells of soap and cinnamon. He shook his head. "Nina," he said, "don't scold. Leave them a sweet. They like corners. Don't let them braid you. Once as a visit, twice as a claim." I laughed at him to his face and then bought a concha at the bakery and left it in the corner of my kitchen on a small plate. I felt ridiculous, and then I slept like I had borrowed sleep from someone rich. In the morning, the concha had a bite out of it. A bite the size of a coin. The sugar on top was scattered in a spiral. On the counter lay a strand of my hair tied with thread into a ring. A ring like a play wedding. The breath went out of me in a single old woman exhalation. I swept the ring into a jar and burned copal the way my grandmother did for saints. The smoke held the corners in place. The last thing that happened on the road again. Another night shift, another fog, my steps a metronome that played with my nerves. When I reached the little roadside cross, the thermos cup was there as always, and beside it lay 3 more little stones. I looked down and saw, very clearly, 2 sets of footprints in the wet grit, mine, wide at the heel, shoulders in the stride, and another, smaller, pointed like a child's, but sharp at the toe, as if the owner stood on the balls of its feet, impatient. They overlapped mine where my braid would lie if I let it. I cut my hair the next day. I didn't tell anyone I did it out of fear. I told them I was tired of the maintenance. I left a candy in the corner on Sundays. I didn't say the word please to the house when I came in at dawn, but I thought it in the way you think thank you to a bus that doesn't splash you. Maybe that's all they want. Acknowledgement and a little sugar. Maybe they want everything. I never found out. I don't invite them, and I don't insult them. I live with the corners politely full. If you walk those fog roads, tuck your hair inside your collar. If you find a braid where there wasn't one, undo it out loud, strand by strand, as if you were untying a promise made on your behalf. And if someone leaves you a ring that looks like your hair, don't try it on. There are unions we can't honor without losing our names. That's my account. Now let's keep going. The dog that climbed like a man. Sierra Mixi, Oaxaca Nagual. Good evening, Senor Williams, and everyone listening in the cabs and kitchens. I'm Martin, 27, a teacher posted to a community off the mountain road from Ayutla. I'm no believer, not by appetite. But belief isn't a door you open. Sometimes it's where you find yourself standing when the lights fail. I share this because on your show a man from Guerrero spoke about a shapeshifter that watched him from a ravine, and the way he said watched made me taste copper. Put out the light if you can. I'll try to keep the switchback straight. The road there is all cleft and curve, a ribbon trying to hold together a region that prefers to stay in pieces. The air is pine and damp clothes and wood smoke that gets into your sweater and lives there. On weekends, I drive down to the bigger town to shop and send voice notes to my mother. I'm fine, I tell her. I'm eating. And outside the truck windows, the fog moves like cattle, slow and numerous. The community where I teach is careful with me in the way you are careful with a borrowed tool. They asked me not to walk at night without calling someone and not to whistle. It calls attention, the director said. She did not specify whose. The first time I saw the dog was late afternoon when the light gets honey flat on the pines. It stood in the ditch, head low, with the color of old sticks. Nothing strange to that. What fixed me was the way it climbed the slope up to the road. Forepaws first together, then hind legs together, like a person wearing a heavy coat on all fours, bound up and reluctant to use its knees. It moved in sets, deliberate, shoulders working under the skin as if the skin had once belonged to someone else. I braked without deciding to. The dog didn't look at me. It lifted itself to the road and then crossed, not running, not trotting, simply crossing in a line that seemed to have been drawn for it. On the far side, it paused at the edge of the trees and put its face up, not to scent, but as if listening. I kept both hands on the wheel and didn't make a sound. It stepped into the green and was gone. I told the director. She met my story with the expression you give a student who admits what he shouldn't have tried. No pases donde no te invitan, she said finally. Don't pass where you're not invited. Y si te hablan por la noche, no contestes. If they call you at night, don't answer. Who? I asked, and she looked out the window at a boy shooting a paper football with a rubber band. Quien sea, she said. Whoever. At night, someone knocked on my door at 1:43 a.m. There's a thin sound when skin touches wood in a place with no insulation. I sat up in bed, heart working like it was earning money, and heard a second knock, the same knuckles measured. I didn't answer. The third came, and with it the scraping sound of claws, not desperate, not angry, a patient testing along the baseboard. I thought of the dog's shoulders, the way they moved under what did not belong to them. Estoy dormido, I whispered to myself, and I wasn't. In the morning, I found 5 print marks in the damp earth by my threshold. Not dog, not bare human. Long toes, a heel that didn't press, and in the center of each, a little hollow, as if the ground had been sucked. I poured coffee grounds over them and brushed pine needles to cover the shapes, the way you cover a small mistake in front of a class so no one laughs. On the walk to school, a neighbor fell in step. She asked if I'd slept and then didn't wait for my answer. "Están inquietos," she said. "They're restless. No se les mira. You don't look at them. No se les habla. You don't speak to them." A week later, the road was slick with a light rain that smelled of steel. I came around a bend where the mountain peels back and gives you a quick slice of sky. Something flashed across the road, fast, small, like a cape thrown low to the ground. I braked, the rear of the truck fishtailed, and I hit it, whatever it was, with the right front bumper. Not hard, not enough to dent, enough to make the steering jump. I got out against my better sense, the rain needled my face. In the ditch, a jacket lay, dark blue, torn at the shoulder. There was no animal. There was only the jacket and a smell that wasn't dog and wasn't man. Metal and wet hair and the rare scent a room has when someone leaves it in the middle of a thought. I picked up the jacket because it was the kind of jacket I could wear to school and because some poor man might freeze without it. The cloth was warm in my hands. At the next stop, a man I knew sat inside the little tienda playing loteria with the owner's teenager. He's older than me, hair slicked back, the kind of eyes that don't ask. And when I came in with the jacket over my arm, he looked at me with a flatness that made me swallow. "Nice jacket," he said, and my mouth got dry. "Found it," I said. He nodded and said, "Bean on the Mermaid." When I turned to leave, I saw a smear at the back of the jacket, at collar height, mud or something darker, and 4 short scratches like someone had held on with small, careful hands. That night, I hung the jacket over a chair and dreamed a man was standing outside my window in a raincoat, his face hidden by the brim of his hat. In the dream, he never moved. When I woke, the chair was empty and the jacket lay folded on the floor, as if it had decided to rest there. My door was locked. The window was latched. There was the smell again, the not smell I can't name. I took the jacket back to the tienda the next day. The older man was there. "This yours?" I asked. He didn't look at it. He looked at me and then at the floor between us. "Keep it," he said. "Te sienta bien. It suits you." Outside, by the step, a dog lay with its head on its paws, not like a dog, like a man waiting out a lecture. When I stepped past, it lifted its eyes and there was a tiredness there that made my ribs ache. As I reached the truck, someone tapped my bumper with a knuckle, once, polite. No one was behind me. I stopped talking after that. Sometimes, silence is the only lock that holds. I drove without whistling. I kept my eyes where the tires met the road. I wore the jacket on days when a wind came from nowhere with the smell of river. It hasn't left me. But when I ride the switchbacks now and feel something move parallel to me through the trees, I don't greet it and I don't insult it. I let it be itself beside me in the world. If you take that road and a dog climbs like a person would when no one is looking, don't name it. Don't call to it like it belongs to you. There are forms, and there are costumes, and there is the dignity of leaving them on their hangers when they're not yours to touch. That's my account. Here's the next one. Hammering in the mountain's throat, Central Andes, Peru, Muki. Good evening, Senor Williams, and everyone who listens with the cab, lights off. My name is Victor. I used to run a haul truck on the access road to a mine above Cerro de Pasco. I'm home now, back to small cargo between Honduras and La Arroya, but there are nights when the wind comes down white from the ice and brings a sound I pray I never hear again. I'm writing, because a miner from Bolivia spoke on your show about a small man in the galleries, and I wanted to add what happens when those galleries push their breath out onto the road. If you can, light a candle or don't. Either way, I'll hold the wheel for us. The high road is a ribbon stretched on bones. You smell diesel and cold and old dynamite, a sour chemical sweetness that lives in the back of the throat. The trucks move slow and deliberate, and the cliffs sit with their arms crossed, waiting for someone to get tired. There are offerings here as common as potholes, coca leaves arranged like little green birds, cigarettes half smoked and balanced on a stone, a thimble of clear liquor with frost dancing on its rim. I left things too. Everyone does. Not out of story, out of statistics. The night it started, the sky had points in it, like glass ground fine. I had the empty bed going down after a double shift. The radio picked up nothing but a thin stitch of music that might have been a huayno if you were charitable. The cab smelled of metal and my own wool hat. As I curved around a bend that tightens like a noose, I heard it. A hammer tick. Not big, not steel on steel, but a small insistent rhythm, tap tap, pause, tap tap, coming from the rock just ahead. Not echo. Source. You hear a lot out there, stone falling far inside the mountain, water gnawing, trucks above you moving like gods. This was none of that. This was someone working at child height just off the shoulder, patient, unconcerned with traffic. The road cut there shows layers like a cake. Gray, darker gray, old white. In the middle of the second gray, something gleamed. A virgin vein no one had claimed. I slowed because greed is a kind of curiosity. The tapping stopped. The silence that fell was tight, like a rope around the ribcage. I rolled past and felt the truck settle on its springs like a big dog lying down. As I cleared the cut, the hammer started again behind me, exactly the same rhythm, as if whatever held it had lost interest in me the second I passed. The hair on my arms tried to climb out of the jacket. I drove the next kilometer without blinking. At the lay-by above the tunnel, the guard shack lamp made its usual honey circle. Old Zarita, who logged the movements with the bored accuracy of a priest, was there with his knit cap pulled low. "You're pale," he said. And then before I could deny anything, he added, "Don't go counting what isn't yours." I stood with my log card in my hand like an idiot and watched the lamp flame jump in visible drafts. He poured a capful of Kana and set it on the windowsill. We didn't look at each other while the night drank it. Inside the tunnel, moisture ran in the grooves like 1,000 tiny snakes. The smell became intimate. Wet rock, iron blood, the wool sweat of men. My high beams pushed forward and put their shoulders on the damp. Somewhere ahead, a laugh pinched shut by a hand became metal skidding and then nothing. Tap tap, pause, tap tap. Closer now, inside the tunnel where neither of us should be. I braked. The sound stopped as if it had only ever been an echo of my braking. I eased forward. Tap tap. The rhythm moved with me, but not at my speed, like someone walking along the wall, small steps, patient feet. Something light touched the outer edge of my right front tire. A pebble maybe, kissing rubber. Then another small sound like teeth on glass. The cab's temperature fell. There's cold that lives outside the skin, and cold that slips between you and yourself. This was the second. My breath smoked in a way the air didn't deserve. I said very softly, "No vengo a sacar nada." I'm not here to take anything. It's a ridiculous sentence to tell a tunnel, but tunnels are ridiculous places. The hammering paused. Then, like a child deciding whether to allow a game to continue, it started up again, farther away, softer. I drove. When I came out, the stars had gone. A smear of gray held the east like a bruise. I parked at the yard and did what men do to reassemble themselves. I washed my hands with water so cold it made me swear. I ate a bread roll like it could anchor me to the world, and I lied to the day crew about a rock slide so I wouldn't have to say a smaller truth I couldn't carry. 2 sleeps later, I carried a concentrate down in weather that made the mountain look bald. Midway, just above a shrine to Santa Barbara, that someone had painted in colors that fought the landscape. I stopped because something signaled me in the body. Not sight, not sound. A suggestion from the job itself. Put on your hazards, pull over. I did. I climbed down, and my boots hit the dirt with that hollow drum the road makes up there. By the front tire, pressed into the dust, were prints the size of my palm. Not boot, not hoof, not a dog. The toes were round and nimble, the heel barely there, as if whoever left them preferred the front of the foot. Between two of the prints lay a lump of ore no larger than a pigeon's egg, blue-silver, wet as if it had been licked. When I bent to pick it up, the air around my hand tightened. My fingers closed and then didn't, like they'd remembered a rule. I left it. I took a cigarette instead, the cheap ones we all smoke up there, and wedged it in the shrine's offering stones. I didn't light it. The wind took the paper smell and carried it into the tunnel mouth below like a message the receiver already understood. The ore was gone when I checked my mirrors to pull back onto the road. Not dropped in the ditch. Gone like a trick well done. The hammering didn't come again. Once as warning, twice as familiarity. Third time as invitation, and I wasn't going to find out which one I'd earned. Now, I run smaller loads on lower roads, where the air has water in it and the wind is a little kinder, but I still keep a cigarette in my pocket that isn't for me, and if a rock sings under my wheels, I don't lean down to hear the tune. There are miners that will tell you the Mookie is a friend if you are humble and feed him and keep his secrets. There are widows who will tell you the same word with a different mouth. Out on the access road, where the mountain coughs and men mistake it for weather, a small sound can get into your bones and stay there until you're nothing but a tuning fork for what isn't yours. If you're ever up there and you hear tapping that keeps pace with your thinking, don't look for it. Don't pick up what shines unless you brought it with you. Leave a little liquor, leave a little coca, leave a little of your pride if you can spare it. Pride is heavy cargo on those curves. That was my account. Let's continue. Backward steps by the river, Cordillera Central, Dominican Republic, Siguapa. Good night, Senor Williams and everyone in the late-night convoy. I'm Elias. I ride motoconcho between San Jose de las Matas and small fincas along the river. People hire me for the last miles where the road frays into stones and clay. I kept this to myself for years because I have a son who asks me if monsters are real and I do not like lying to him. Turn off your light if you can. Let's idle near the water for a while. It was mango season and the air was sweet with the rot, no one minds. My bike carried a man and a sack of cement. We wove the potholes like dances we knew. The river there is a moving piece of glass with fish you think are leaves. On the far bank, the pines hold themselves with the dignity of men at a wake. It was near dusk, when every noise has a shadow, that the passenger asked me to stop so he could drink. I killed the engine. The quiet that falls when a motor dies has a weight you can feel in your gums. We heard a soft rush, like hair being shaken out. Across the shallow, on a bar of white stones, a woman stood with her back to us. Long hair to her ankles, dark as oil in a pan. She wore nothing I could see except her hair. She didn't move. The air cooled as if someone had stretched a cloth over the sun. No Myers, my passenger said, and I would laugh about that kind of instruction if I hadn't obeyed. I didn't look, but in not looking, I saw everything. We drank from our own bottle, eyes on the ground, like men who've stumbled into a room where they have no invitation. When we climbed back on, I fumbled the key. I felt watched the way a church makes you feel watched even when it's empty. As we pulled away, the stones shifted under the bike and I put a foot down to steady us. My boot made a print. Beside it, delicate and wrong, a bare foot marked the clay. Heel where toes should be, toes where heel should be. like a dancer who had turned around inside her own body. The track paralleled ours for 3 steps and then vanished into the water without a splash. I didn't tell my passenger what I saw. He didn't tell me not to tell him. On the road, the pines made a tunnel that smelled of resin and shade. I heard a bird, then another, then no bird. My mirrors showed nothing, and I was suddenly certain that they were too small to show what mattered. I kept the bike under 40. You don't outrun what isn't chasing you. At the turnoff to his place, he pressed money into my palm and closed my fingers over it. "Para tu hijo," he said. "For your boy." The bill was damp. I rode on as the dark knotted itself between the trunks. Past the bridge, my front light landed on a figure between trees. Long hair, small and still, and my hand did what a hand does when it has more fear than sense. I cut the light. We went blind. The road isn't a road without light. It's memory and hope and the weight of your shoulders. The engine purred like a cat I didn't own. The smell came then, wet river stone, the green of crushed guava leaves, and something animal that wasn't sweat and wasn't musk. Not a warning, not an invitation, not for me. At home, my son sat on the steps, homework in his lap, pencil behind his ear. "You're late," he said, in that impartial voice boys have when they tell the truth. I hugged him too hard. My wife asked if I wanted coffee and then if I wanted to tell her why my shirt was cold against her cheek. I said no to both. I dreamt of hair in the water like a weed and woke with my tongue dry. For a while, small things changed their place in our house. The broom lay with its bristles toward the door. The comb turned with its teeth facing the window. My son's toy horse had its mane braided in a tiny, clumsy plait. The radio sputtered at dawn, a coil of voice and static, tuneless and thin, and then went quiet the second I stood. I kept my mouth closed because names can be invitations. A week later, I had to take the river road at night with a man who smelled of rum and sorrow. We passed the same white stones. The moon had eaten the clouds. There was light enough to pretend the world was simple. On the bank, a series of prints marked the damp. Backward feet. Delicate. The gait of someone who doesn't fall. I slowed out of respect. The man hummed a hymn under his breath and didn't notice he was doing it. Near the cemetery that looks over the water, the engine coughed. Not a failure, like a child playing with breath. It coughed again and died. We coasted, stopped, and listened to the frogs measuring our fear. Then, from just beyond the ditch, a motion. Hair lifting and settling as if air had fingers. I did not look. I reached into my pocket and took out the little mirror my wife keeps there so she can check her mouth when we stop for coffee. I held it flat in my palm, face up like an offering. The dark held an outline. In the mirror, for an instant, hair eclipsed stars and then the stars came back. I put the mirror on the road. The engine started on the first try. The next morning, the mirror was on our doorstep, face down. I left a pan of milk on the step because I'm not proud. It was gone by noon and our cat had been shut in the shed all morning. I don't pass the river at dusk now. When I have to, I keep my light on and my mouth shut. If I see hair where there shouldn't be hair, I look at the ground. Not out of shame. Out of an understanding that not all beauty is kind to the ones who see it wrong. For my boy, I tell him monsters depend on the road and the season, and whether you whistled when you shouldn't have. Then, I tell him to be polite to water and to step lightly where birds drink. If your wheels slide a little by a stone bar near a shallow, and a print beside yours faces the wrong way, don't fix it with words. Don't hoot. Don't tell your friend what he didn't see. Leave a reflection. Leave a little milk. Leave the idea that you know everything and you might get home. That was my account. On to the next. The whistle that wasn't wind. Misiones. Paraguay Pombero. Good evening, Senor Williams and night people. I'm Diego. I drive a long-haul bus from Posadas to tiny colonias where the red earth stains everything it touches. I hadn't planned to write Who Wants to Be the Driver Who Admits Hearing Things, but a farmer called into your show last month about a whistle in the yerba fields, and I felt that whistle in the fillings of my teeth. Dim your light and take a seat. I'll keep the route smooth. The red dirt road at night is a ribbon laid on hot brick. The bush breathes. The air smells of crushed yerba leaves, damp wood, and when it's going to rain, the first sour of lightning. People out here leave offerings like they're paying a toll, a cigar end, a capful of cana, a sweet biscuit, balanced on a fence post where the path cuts between embocaya palms. I used to chuckle, and then I lost the appetite for laughing. It was a Tuesday with 6 passengers and a box of chicks cheeping like a squeaky drawer. The whistle came from the lift of the land on my right. 3 notes, not bird, not boy. It had the shape of a person's intention behind it, and a tone that didn't belong to a mouth. I touched the horn, just a light hello, and immediately felt like I'd greeted a neighbor who didn't live on my street. The whistle answered. 2 notes this time. Close, as if whoever made it had stepped down onto the road to pace me. "Do you hear that?" a woman in the second row asked. She had a basket of guavas that made the bus smell like someone had mopped with juice. "Bird," I said. "At night?" she asked. We both knew the answer. Ahead, a palm leaned over the track and the moon made coins out of the dead fronds. On the fence post beneath it, the usual, a stubby cigar, paper pulled away so the tobacco could breathe, and a little glass with a mouthful of liquor bending the moon in its curve. As I drew level, something small moved in the ditch and then matched our speed without the sound of steps. It kept just beyond the edge of the headlight. It didn't break the grass. The whistle came again, softer, and the box of chicks went quiet between one squeak and the next, as if a hand had patted them all at once. I didn't stop. I don't stop where there's polite company I haven't invited. But the road decided to produce a reason for me. A calf had pushed a gap in the fence and stood, lost in the bus's bright, eyes shocked to see themselves reflected so large. I braked. The whistle came from under the bus then, impossibly, a little burst that made the hair on my thighs rise under my pants like I was a dog. I looked down. Between the tires, a shadow leaned as if it had an elbow. It had the outline of a boy and the age of an old man. It didn't resolve into either. I got out slow, talking to the calf, using the voice you use with someone else's child. The air smelled of warm hide and green tobacco, and the yeasty note of liquor left open. I moved to the front, hand out like I could pay for passage with posture. Under the bumper sat the cigar from the fence post, still burning as if it had been lit for me, not by me. Beside it, the little glass was empty and wet at the rim as if lips had touched it. The whistle, right by my ear now, sounded like a kiss blown by someone who'd watched people and practiced. "Gee, pardon," I said. "I don't know to whom." I nudged the calf back with the gentlest shove you can give a living thing that weighs more than you planned. It stepped into the dark as if the whistle had told it how. I set the cigar back on the fence and the little glass beside it. I didn't look into the ditch. You don't look when someone is doing you the favor of not being seen. Back in the bus, the passengers didn't speak for 3 kilometers. Then the guava woman said, as if completing a different conversation, "He likes sweets." "Who?" said the boy in the back with the baseball cap and the grin he wore like a knife. She sighed. "The one who whistles," she said. The boy lowered his eyes like he'd been told to in church. At the next stop, a man with dirt half-moons under his nails got on with a sack that smelled like pigs. He watched me fumble my change and shook his head. "You gotta give him something he asked for," he said, uninvited. "Not what you think is generous." He took a wrapped candy from his pocket, the kind kids buy in twos, and set it on the dashboard. "For him," he said. "Not you." We rolled again. The whistle moved with us a while and then peeled away, back into the fence lines where the palms ticked like the ribs of a drum. The candy wrapper wrinkled in the heat and then lay flat without a hand. When I reached the terminal, the candy was gone, and the dash was sticky with sugar like a child had licked it clean. For a week, everything small I mislaid turned up where a man of that height would rest his arm. The bus's key on the gatepost, my pocket knife in the crook of the mirror, a coin balanced on the step. The chicks found their voices again, then lost them at random until I bought 2 more candies and left them on the fence post at the curve where the palms lean. After that, the bus sounded like itself. I don't tell the new drivers what to believe. I tell them where the road holds the heat longer and where fog lives in the hollows, and where men who stomp their feet at what they don't see blow a tire where a courteous one doesn't. If you hear a whistle that belongs to no mouth, don't imitate it. Don't answer like a boy mocking a songbird. If you must speak, thank the empty air and leave a little sugar where a small elbow would rest. If your change goes missing and turns up somewhere that makes you laugh, laugh with a closed mouth. Some neighbors accept your company better if they don't have to see your teeth. That's my account. Let's move to the next one. Strings on the cobblestone. Good night, Senor Williams, and everyone who lets the night be night. I'm Sophia, 24, a student, and I rented a room off the Calle de los Pasos while I worked shifts at a cafe. I didn't plan to live alone with the sound of my shoes on stone. I write now because a man on your show said a small figure sat at the end of his bed braiding his horse's mane, and I have not had a horse in my life, but I woke with knots that no human hand tied. Dim the light and walk the street with me. Antigua at night is perfume and mildew. The walls hold their damp the way old linen holds tears. The cafe's shut and the cobbles get their say. Wet stone, sugar burnt into coffee grounds, incense that lifts itself from old church stones, even when there's no mass. I closed most nights, counted the till with fingers that smelled like chocolate and bleach, and walked home with my keys showing between my knuckles, not because I expected a man, because the city has its old men and you feel them if you're quiet. I first heard the guitar on a Monday when everyone was kinder to everyone else than they deserve. A small, bright plucking that didn't carry the weight of a person's hand. The notes came from above the street, from a balcony that nobody can afford and everyone lives under. They weren't a song, they were the suggestion of one, the kind someone plays when they're deciding if they want to hurt you. I turned my head because curiosity is a trait I don't wish to lose. On the edge of the balcony sat a figure the height of a 6-year-old. Big hat, like a shadow pretending to be a hat. He swung his legs like a boy who has been told not to. I looked down quick. I don't give strangers permission easily, and you can give it with eyes. The notes followed me a block, threaded between the ironwork like a cat. When I turned onto my street, they stopped. At home, the house smelled like stale bread and old flowers. My roommate had left a note saying she'd be gone a week. I took a shower that didn't warm up and went to bed with my hair wet because stubbornness is a cheap thrill. I woke with it braided in 2 plaits that began in the back of my head, so tight the scalp burned. I live alone with my stubbornness, but I didn't tie those braids. I undid them carefully. Hair makes a sound when it lets go. You don't notice until you must. On the pillow lay a piece of black thread fine as a violin string. I knotted it around my finger and it broke like spider silk. I didn't tell anyone, not out of fear of being laughed at, out of fear of having to be believed. 2 nights later, I closed again. The guitar waited. On the corner by the ruined church, a small man in a big hat sat on a low wall with his legs crossed, playing a box with strings that didn't look like a guitar and didn't look like not a guitar. He didn't look up. He didn't perform. He existed in the space where performing would have lived if he had been someone else. As I passed, the laces of my boots tied themselves tighter without my hands. Not a prank, a decision. The knots were small, cunning, boyish. On Friday, I was stupid, there's no other word. A friend from the cafe pressed a ribbon into my hand, a bright blue thing she wore in school. "Tie it if you're scared," she said, meaning the ribbon like an amulet, like a joke. I tied it around the end of my braid as I left work. Half a dare, half an apology to the part of me that enjoys spectacle. The guitar notes greeted me like a dog. At the halfway point between the cafe and home, the ribbon jumped on my hair as if someone had flicked it with a finger. I stopped. The hat brim, above and to my right, tipped with the smallest approval. I walked on, and I swear the street tilted its head to listen. I dreamed that night of hands at the end of my bed. Not big hands. Quick, small, curious hands that smell of dust and resin. They touched my ankle bones as if counting lines, then moved to my hair with the focus of a child making forts with a blanket. I woke with a headache, like a tight band, and found my braids threaded with horsehair. I don't own a horse. The strands were coarse, pale, not mine. Tied into my hair, woven in, finished with bows I would never tie. The smell of old tack hung in the room. I cut those braids off with kitchen scissors. I cried over the sink, not for the hair, for the feeling of being handled while asleep, the helplessness dressed in a prankster's outfit. I burned the hair in a coffee can in the courtyard while the neighbor's cat watched with the attention of a creature that respects ritual when it's done without flourish. The smoke smelled like a saddle burning and something sweet, like corn liquor. The guitar didn't stop. It followed me at the corners, and the hat brim stayed where a brim would be if it were kinder. I stopped wearing braids. I wore my hair up, tight, plain, and I bought a small bag of chickpeas and left it on the wall by the ruined church, because I had heard from a woman who hears more than she says that sweets calm small hands when they mean too well. The next morning, the chickpeas were scattered in a circle, each with a single bite taken out, neat as a schoolboy. It's easy to say I imagined this because I wanted attention. It is harder to explain the knots in my bootlaces that I had to cut, the strings left on my pillow like the idea of a gift, the way every girl in my row of rooms began to find her horse's mane braided in the morning, metaphorically speaking, wire hangers threaded with thread, a plant bent into a plate, the cat's whiskers arranged in parallel on the mat with a bow that never held because the cat objected. You can't live with a joke that never checks if you're laughing. I moved after a month. There's no victory in that sentence. The new place has a courtyard with laundry lines and a view of a volcano that does what it promises. No guitar on my street. Sometimes when I pass the ruined church on my way to the market, I leave a piece of bread on the wall. It's gone when I come back, and the wall feels like the back of a sleeping animal. Warm, companionable, a thing with its own dreams. If you hear a small guitar on a balcony and a hat brim that is more shadow than cloth, don't look up and wave. Don't give permission with your eyes. Keep your hair to yourself, and if you must leave something, leave food that doesn't bind, bread that crumbles, sugar that dissolves, offerings that can be finished without starting anything. Some attentions don't know when to stop being tender, and tenderness wielded without sense can wear grooves into you like any other tire. That's my account. Here's the last one. The borrowed face on the Salt Road. Good evening, Senor Williams and community. I'm Noelia, 40. I drive a small freight truck between Uyuni and small settlements, where salt dries in sheets under a sky that doesn't know how to end. I've kept this quiet because the wind here carries stories like for sale signs, and I didn't want my name stapled to one. I'm sending it now because I heard a miner's widow speak on your show about something that took her husband's shape to ask for a light, and I tasted the metal tang of the lithium brine in my mouth. Dim your light. The road is white and bright enough for both of us. It was late winter. The air had that glass edge, and the world smelled like the inside of a freezer. Clean until something dies in it. I carried crates of bolts and sacks of quinoa, an ordinary load that made an ordinary noise. A crosswind lifted fine salt and made a veil over everything. The horizon here is a coin you can't spend. 2 hours out, on a stretch where the road goes arrow straight to teach you humility, I saw a man standing on the margin, thumb not out, simply there. He wore a jacket that had once been someone's good jacket, and now was someone else's. A knit cap pulled low, and his face, God forgive me for saying it, looked like a drawing of a face done from memory. The features were where they should be, but they didn't occupy the space they were given. I slowed because that's what you do out here when the next headlight is an hour away and men freeze. He climbed in without a word. The cold came with him. A dry cold that made the inside of my nose ache. He smelled like iron filings and the faint sweetness of coca chewed long. His hands were clean and wrong, the nails too square, the knuckles too even. He looked out the windshield with interest, the way a child looks at a toy that used to be his. "Where to?" I asked. He didn't answer. He tapped the dash just once, like he was thinking, and that felt worse than any answer could. I kept driving. The salt flat to our left shone under the thin sun. To the right, dark land shouldered up in beds. He turned his head then and looked at me, not like a man looks at a woman, like a traveler looks at a map to see if the line he's on will take him home. He had the eyes of a man I knew, Cheo, who ran tires at the yard and laughed like a man who doesn't trust laughter. Cheo had been buried a month. I watched my hands stay steady on the wheel because they knew what I didn't want to know. "You need water?" I said, because the game is to make every offer practical. He didn't nod or shake his head. He put his hand flat on the glove compartment. I opened it. Inside was a rosary tangled with a wrench, a sock without a mate, and a boiled sweet in twisted plastic. He took the sweet, unwrapped it with care, and pressed the wrapper flat against the glass of the window with the wet of his tongue as if to seal something in or out. He put the sweet on his tongue and did not close his mouth to enjoy it. The candy dissolved without movement. Near the turnoff to San Juan, the wind shifted and the cab filled with the smell of burning weeds, though there was nothing burning. I thought of my mother telling me not to accept food from anyone who didn't swallow. I thought of Cheo asking me for a light last summer, and me, laughing, telling him his own teeth could strike sparks. The man beside me opened his mouth wider. The candy was gone. His face stayed where it had been, like the dessert course on a plate after the waiter lifts the plate. "Yakasi," I said, to fill air. Almost there. He looked at me with Cheo's eyes, and then beyond me, as if the road had continued through my chest. His hand lifted once and pressed 2 fingers to the windshield. They left no mark. A gust hit us and the truck shivered. I shivered with it. The temperature fell in a way you feel under your fingernails. We reached the junction where the road bends and the wind always has an opinion. I braked to turn. He opened the door and stepped out with the carefulness of someone who has borrowed legs. He didn't look back. He didn't motion. He walked across the road in a straight line and stopped at the very center where the 2 ruts cross. There, he lifted his face to the wind, and for an instant it took the features it was owed. The nose shifted. The mouth widened. The cheeks sank, and I saw Cheo's face clearly, the way you see a friend in a crowd when he turns his head and the light makes him whole. Then the wind pulled the features apart and set them back like cards, and the man was a drawing again. He stepped off the road onto the salt. The first step made no mark. The second left a small gray print that filled with water. He took 3 more steps and then wasn't. Not blown or dropped. Not there in the way a name isn't on a list when you know it should be. The wind flattened my hair against my skull. I sat with my hands around the wheel like a prayer I didn't know the words for. At San Juan, they were burning dried brush in the plaza, and the smell of that went through me like a comb. In the yard, a boy played with a tire, rolling it with all his concentration. I asked after Cheo without asking after Cheo. His mother still cries, someone said, and the day went on, big and unkind. I found the sweet wrapper on the inside of the passenger window when I cleaned the cab a week later. It had a print on it, not a fingerprint, not whorl and line, but the ghost of a lip that had not closed, salt crystals stuck to the sugar like stars. Now, when I drive the salt road, I keep a sweet in the glove box and a little coca for men with old habits. I don't pick up what looks like a man unless he lifts his hand and the hand looks like it has handled work. If I must stop, I stop with my wheels dead on the road, not 1 centimeter into the salt. And if someone steps out and stands with the wind eating his face into parts, I don't say a name I miss. Names make bridges. Bridges make crossings. If you ever see a drawing of a man waiting by a white road where sound is a rumor, keep the cab warm but your mouth closed. Offer what dissolves. Don't offer what binds. And don't look too long at a face that keeps almost becoming someone you loved. The wind up here is a good sculptor and a bad friend. Midnight Fork in Las Animas. Good night, Senor Williams and the Relatos de la Noche community. My name is Ramiro. I haul produce from Durango down to Parral, and I'm writing because last month, after hearing an episode where a driver spoke about a road that swallowed the clock, I finally got the push I needed. I've kept this to myself for years, ashamed of how scared I was, how small it made me feel. I know these roads. I grew up between mesquites and dry riverbeds, but what happened by Las Animas on the old Libre was not a curve you can take with better brakes. Turn off the light and let me take you there. That afternoon had been all dust and the sour metal taste of anxiety. I'd argued with my brother about money for my mother's medicine. The heat pressed on the windshield. A film of grime over the sky. South of Durango City, the hills go from ochre to the gray of a dead fire, and the road narrows where the grass gives up. I stopped in a rancheria to top off diesel and grabbed a coffee that tasted like burnt sugar in a cracked styrofoam cup. The attendant's radio played a norteño song through a dying speaker. Thin, tinny, like it was coming from further than the radio itself. I remember the smell of dry leather from my seat, the sting of sweat salt on my eyebrows. The fork is not on maps, not clearly. Locals call it the Fork of Las Animas. On the right, a strip of asphalt patched with darker rectangles, climbing a ridge scattered with nopales. On the left, a dirt track that looks like it once mattered. 2 ruts polished by decades of tires, now crusted over and choked with chorizo. I took the right, like always. It was around dusk. The Serrano cold was creeping under my shirt. The sky had that copper color when the sun is already gone, but refuses to admit it. At the fork's shoulder, there's a wayside cross, blackened by weather. The base is full of candles half melted and plastic roses bleached bone white. As I began to pass it, I caught a flicker that didn't match the wind. Every flame bent toward the dirt track at the left, like a crowd turning their heads at once. I eased off the gas without thinking. The radio went to static, then to a whisper of a different station. Murmurs of a rosary and a bell counting 9 slow strokes. My dashboard clock froze on 7:19. I told myself it was the alternator. I told myself a lot of things. I rolled to a stop and got out because that's what you do when your gut says your truck has a new sound. The air smelled of copal, faint and wrong for a weekday. Under my boots, the gravel felt damp, as if the road had sweated. The candles at the cross didn't flicker in the breeze anymore. They held perfectly still, their flames like painted drops. I could hear very faintly cenceros from cattle that weren't visible anywhere. A hollow, distant clank, and the soft hush of a crowd, though there was no one. There was a feria there once. My father had mentioned it when I was little. A traveling fair that set up near Dry Arroyo each year under strings of paper flags. He said my tio met my tia at the dance there. He said the last year it came, a bus missed the fork and sank into a wash that had turned to mud after a storm. He said the road changed after that, as if it had swallowed a date and choked on it. Standing there, I smelled fritanga, oil that had been used too long. I heard a drum beat, 3 hits, pause, 3 hits, and a trumpet warming up. The dirt track to the left, the one nobody uses, was no longer choked. It was neatly combed with tire treads, damp and dark. A string of papal picado hung across it from nowhere to nowhere, impossible in that open slope. Every cut-out skull frozen in place. I didn't see anyone, but the sense of bodies was so strong my mouth filled with the taste of coins. I should have gotten in and driven on. Instead, I walked 4, maybe 5 steps down the left track. The temperature dropped, like opening a refrigerator in a church. The mesquites ahead were not the same ones I'd seen from the highway. They were fuller, the kind that haven't been grazed down yet. On the ground, a soda glass bottle lay with an old label I hadn't seen since I was a kid. My boots sank half a centimeter into mud that shouldn't have been there in October. The radio in my truck, doors open, keys in, faded in and out with voices saying raffle numbers, a woman laughing, a child crying just once and then not again. Something moved where the arroyo should have been. Not a person, not a dog. It moved like a shadow that had forgotten its body. And then, across that empty air, a handful of sawdust drifted by, catching purple light from nowhere. It fell. But so slowly it might as well have hung. The sawdust arranged itself along a line at my feet. Half the grains stopped mid-fall, held between my boot and the road as if strung on an invisible thread. That's when I realized. It wasn't that the candles were still. It was that everything was held at a speed too slow to be life. I moved my hand. I could move it, but it left a smear like dragging through honey. A fly hung 3 feet from my face, wings up, legs spread, like a tin toy. The bell that should have rung a 10th stroke stayed at 9. Sound stretched into a long wire I could walk beside. A man's figure appeared down the track, wearing a white cowboy hat, paused mid-step, heel never touching. He did not turn. He did not speak. He stayed in a nearly step that vibrated a fraction, that sent a tremor into my teeth. I knew that hat. I knew that angle. My brother owns the same hat and walks the same. I took a 6th step. A woman's hand, no arm attached that I could see, passed in front of the hanging papal picado, moving like a fish under still water. Her fingers left little vacuums in the air, and the paper dipped and returned not to the same place. The smell of copal thickened until my eyes watered. I wanted to call out, but the first syllable of my brother's name stretched across my tongue and never left. In that syrup of time, the only thing that seemed quick was a memory. My brother arguing with me that morning. The white rim of his hat flashing as he left my mother's little kitchen. My 7th step landed on something soft, and the ground under me hiccuped. In my left ear, right against it, I felt the touch of breath. Not heard, felt. It smelled like damp cotton and feria dust. That breath pushed the last grains of sawdust to complete the line at my boot, and where they lay, the dirt darkened. A wet line crossing the track like a rule I had just put a toe across. When I yanked my foot back, time snapped. The 9th bell finished ringing, and then the 10th slammed my eardrum. The candles gusted like a flock scattering. Papo Picado ripped in an instant from nothing. The dirt track ahead was again the dead ruts choked with carrizo. My dashboard clock jumped to 9:41. The radio found the same norteño song, but in a different verse. My coffee had cooled to the metallic skin you get when you've been gone long enough. In my boot, something scritched against my toes. It was sawdust, compacted into a pellet. I shook it out into my hand. It was not wood anymore. It was a tiny, perfect paper flag, purple, cut with the skull pattern that had hung across the track. I drove on because I could do nothing else. I wanted to call my brother, to apologize for nothing and everything, but the phone stayed with a single blinking bar all the way to Paro. I pulled into a yard full of stacked crates, and the security guard asked if I'd had trouble because I was late by more than 2 hours. The invoice printer smelled like overheated plastic. The line on my boot, the mud line, never scrubbed out. That night, my mother called me before I could call them. She said she had dreamed of a feria and woke up with copal in her nose. She said my brother had gone out to clear his head and hadn't come back yet. He came back the next morning, hat in hand, quiet as a prayer. He wouldn't look me in the eye. Why am I writing now? Because 2 weeks ago the plastic roses at the fork were new, red, and the cross had a second name hanging from it, the same first name as my brother. He is alive, but something else with his name is not. I don't go by Las Animas anymore, but when wind shifts to the left, I smell stale oil and hear 9 bells in my teeth. Don't step off the road when the road asks you to. If the clocks pause by a wayside cross, keep both hands on the wheel and go. That is my account, Senor Williams. Let's keep listening, but if anyone out there knows that fork, please pass without stopping. Mile 23 in the Rumorosa fog. Hello, Senor Williams, and good night to everyone in this community. My name is Daniela. I'm a dispatcher for an import company in Tijuana, and I heard a recent story about a driver who crossed La Rumorosa when the wind was grinding the rocks. I grew up hearing about that climb, about torn tires and lost brakes, about the desert that eats to the bone. But what I saw 2 winters ago wasn't the wind. It was a silence so heavy it bent time. Turn off the light. If you've driven with me over the radio at 3 a.m., you know my voice. Tonight, I need yours to keep me brave. We had a shipment to Tecate, nothing unusual. Boxed parts that rattled like broken maracas. I took my own car because I had to meet a driver who was making that route for the first time. The night tasted of metal and cold dust. My breath carried that dry smell you get by the mesas. A marine layer had crept this far inland, not fog like the coast. This was chalk, a body you could lean against. It made every headlight a stained halo. Kilometer marker 23. I pulled into a turnout he couldn't miss. There's a small stone shrine there, a virgin, with her blue faded to the color of old denim. Someone had left a cup of coffee on her little ledge. I could smell it, coffee deola, cinnamon, and piloncillo that made my teeth ache remembering my aunt's kitchen in Mexicali. I turned down the radio, but the static stayed, like dust rubbing a balloon. My phone jumped to 258 and stuck there. I watched it for a long time, thinking only of minutes, not the deeper thing. He never arrived. The truck lights I expected were always about to appear around the corner, but never did. In the fog, sound gets weird. You hear voices and think they are in your car, and then you realize it's a trailer in the distance, or your own blood in your ear. I got out to stretch and to stop myself from checking the phone every breath. The air was a refrigerator crammed with wet stone. My eyelashes caught droplets. The fabric of my jacket turned to sandpaper against my neck. And then the road went quiet in a way I've never known. No tire hiss, no wind, no insects. The static on the radio flattened into a line and stayed there, a held note that forgot to fall. On the far side of the turnout, a flagger stood in an orange vest, back to me, holding a round sign. He wasn't there when I parked. He didn't turn when I said buenas, because that's habit, to greet even shadows when you're alone. His vest was not the fabric they use now. It was more like plastic from the 90s, too shiny, unbent. His boots were new, wrong for that place. He lifted the sign and I realized it was not a modern stop. It was a red circle with white letters that said "Par" in an old font I haven't seen since I was a child. He didn't move otherwise, not even the smallest shift you see when someone is breathing. His arm trembled, but not up and down, sideways, as if the air itself was glitching. Behind him, the fog thinned just enough to show trucks lined on the grade, cab to bumper, all tilted like they were climbing and had frozen mid-climb. One driver had his hand out the window, palm up, fingers half curled, the gesture of someone about to ask for a light. The gesture never finished. I walked toward the flagger. My breath made clouds that didn't drift. They hung and spread until they were almost a wall I could touch. Somewhere, but nowhere near, I heard the sound of a wrench hitting concrete. One ping, stretched into a band that I could have tied around my wrist. My phone stayed at 2:58. The Virgin's coffee didn't steam. It held a perfect skin that reflected the fog as if it were a ceiling. The flagger raised his spare hand, one finger up. The old sign remained at shoulder height. A small piece of gravel floated at the hem of his vest, caught in a lift that never became wind. I wanted to circle him, to see his face. Something in me said no. Not fear, exactly. An old rule: don't walk around a person like that on this mountain. Don't pass the sign that says "Par" when the road itself has chosen to obey it. I turned the radio dial. It didn't change the sound, but the pointer under the plastic slid as if greased with oil. I thought of my father driving this grade with cab windows down, shouting over the engine, with a red Virgin sticker on the dash. I thought of the day we buried him, the way the wind at the cemetery near La Hechicera carried grit that got under my tongue. Memory does not freeze. It runs when time stops. Maybe that's why it hurts. From the fog above us, a figure emerged on the slope. An older man in a long coat, the kind of leather that turns glossy with years. He was walking a path that I didn't know existed, moving across scree that should have slid. He carried something I first took for a lantern, but it was not lit. It was a glass box with a candle inside, its wick long and white and dry. He held the box carefully, like carrying a nest. He stepped, paused with his heel never reaching the ground, then stepped again without completing the first one. At the lip of the turnout, he stopped altogether. He never turned to me. He never made sound. He lifted the glass box a few inches, as people do when they show you a child, while they don't want to let you touch it. Inside the box, something lay that threw back the fog in a shape I recognized. A circular reflector, the kind they use to mark switchbacks, scratched and cloudy. In the frozen second that second took, I understood that what he carried was a piece of road that had been taken out of time long ago, a switchback that never finished its turn. He lowered the box. He kept walking along the air as if the path were there. He was gone into the white where the rock starts. When the lights came, my driver finally arriving, they came all at once, like someone hit on pause and life tripped over itself to catch up. Air rushed in. The coffee steamed and spilled. The radio blurted a weather alert and then a norteño ballad out of tune. The flagger wasn't there, the trucks behind him were not there. Gravel fell from where it had floated and bounced with a dozen late pings. My phone leaped to 319 and my throat burned like I'd run. My driver coasted into the turnout with his hands at 10 and 2, eyes too wide. "You saw them?" he asked, and the way he asked told me yes even before I answered. I lied and said no because I am the one who has to be the calm in the room, the one who tells other people to breathe. But he kept glancing in the mirror as if expecting a line of trucks to be behind him without sound. I never take that turnout now. If I have to pull over, I do it lower, where the scrub smells like creosote after rain and the wind keeps your heartbeat honest. There's a new reflector along a curve near kilometer 24. It catches the fog strange, throwing back not my own headlights but something older, like a photograph soaked in milk. I won't look at it directly. If the mountain asks you to stop, don't bargain. Stop. Put your hands on the wheel. Wait for your minute to return or to become a different minute. That's all we can do up there. That's my story. We keep driving because we must. Let the next testimony take the lane. Salt line at Chachalacas. Hello, Senor Williams. Hello, community. I write from Cardel, Veracruz. I'm Jorge. I deliver ice and sodas from the plant by the highway out to the Palapas along Chachalacas Beach. I kept this to myself because my father always said not to talk about brujeria you don't understand. But then I heard a tale here about a man who found his own watch in wet sand before he'd lost it. So, I'll tell you what I stepped over on a night when the air tasted of salt and fireworks. Turn off the light, and if you've ever driven that 2-lane past the dunes, breathe with me. It was May, around the time of San Isidro. The fields were a patchwork of green sugarcane and the brown stubble where they'd burned. The smell of smoke fat like pork in the air. The coastal road from Cardel to the beach is straight until it isn't, and the wind carries sand across it so it looks like a sheet that something big is sleeping under. I was late because my cousin borrowed the truck and returned it without gas. At the plant, the night watchman heated coffee de olla on a coil, and the cinnamon clung to my throat while the mosquitoes whined like a dentist's drill. By the time I hit the last curve before the river mouth, the moon had gone behind a sheet of high cloud, and the air got wet the way it does before a storm you can't see yet. On the right, there's a clump of palms where people sometimes set candles for the drowned. As my lights swung across them, I saw a white line drawn tight across the asphalt, as if someone had spilled a bag of salt and then combed it carefully with a finger. It wasn't patchy, like an accident. It was a string, clean, so straight it hurt. On each side of the road, the same line continued up the sandy shoulder, over crab holes, under the bunched grass, and kept going into the dark. I slowed without meaning to. Salt is nothing. The tide leaves salt. The wind paints with salt. I told myself all that as I rolled to a stop with my front tires kissing that line. The engine clattered and settled. My radio, the old one that only knows 3 stations, breathed a tinny bolero and then coughed into nothing. The air felt fat with static, every hair on my arms lifting. And the smell. That's what I remember more than anything. Suddenly, the smell was the first day after a storm. Wet rope, dead fish, and that sour sweet of mangrove rot that sticks to your molars. Behind me, a pickup I hadn't seen eased up, its driver loose in the seat like a man who has all night. He killed his lights, he didn't honk, he just waited. I could see a cigarette coal, a small sun, suspended. A dog somewhere gave one sharp yip and then strained into silence. I opened my door. The sand in the road hissed softer than snakes. When I stepped down, my boot sank less than it should have. The salt line wasn't grains. It was a cord, braided fine. The crystals melted together by humidity into threads. On the far side of it, the wind stopped, same as if I'd reached a glass wall. The palms at the roadside held their fronds mid-sway, each leaflet arrested in its curve. The surface of the road itself lost its shine. It went matte, like slate used too long to write prayers. A palapa up ahead flickered to life, but not with electric bulbs. It was lanterns, the hurricane kind with glass, hung in a row, their chimneys smudged with soot. The air in there had weight and color, a yellow that belonged to other years. People moved between the posts, but I couldn't see their faces, only the way their shoulders lifted, the way a woman's scarf caught in a gust that didn't blow in my world. I heard La Bamba on a radio too rich to be from my dash, but the tempo was wrong, slower, like a record at the wrong speed. Feet stamped, a laugh burst and hung like a bead on a string. In the middle of the road, two boys were playing with a spinning top, the wooden kind, hands and wrists and a length of string. I had not seen a trompo in years. One boy's mouth was open in a shout. The top didn't spin, it hung tilted, its painted lines blurred like rain in headlights. The boy's string hovered slack from his fist like water stopped mid-pour. Both boys wore shorts too short for now and sandals with tires for soles. They were right in my headlights and cast no shadows. The pickup behind me clicked as its engine cooled. The man inside tossed his cigarette and it hung in the air above the salt line without falling. He whispered a word I couldn't make out through my open window. I didn't want to step across. My father's warnings had a shape in my chest. But my job is to deliver ice, and the ice was sweating. I imagined it melting into bags of warm water, clients angry, my cousin blaming me for the fuel, my mother for the argument we still had cooking. The only way was forward. I stepped over the line with my right foot. The temperature dropped so fast my teeth clicked. The smell changed. Now copal, now the sharp tang of limes cut on a board that never quite comes clean. The boys in their top didn't move, but the top sang a low note, an insect note, the sound climbing as if I had an accelerator under my heel that I was pressing so softly I couldn't feel it. The lantern-lit palapa flared, the yellow turned briefly white, and in that flash I saw, not faces, but hands. An old man's hand on a young woman's wrist, a woman's hand shelling shrimp, a child's hand reaching for a bottle. Every nail had that chalk line people who work with salt get. I didn't make it more than one step. Not because something stopped me, because a whisper of air returned across my face from behind, and it carried a word I suddenly understood. The man in the pickup said no with the voice of a kid who has learned that fire burns and is about to watch someone else learn it the hard way. His no slipped over the salt line like a fish passing a net, and the top wobbled and fell and never hit the road. I lifted my foot back. The no cut off mid-breath. The pickup's cigarette fell and hissed on wet asphalt. The lanterns went dark so fast the afterimage burned my eyes. The boys were not in the road. La Bamba snapped into the right speed from a bad radio and then into commercials selling soap. The wind found the palms and shook them hard enough to drop dead fronds. My dashboard clock jumped from 10:12 to 11:03. The ice bags had sweated and then stopped. Beads of water in a geometry that made my mouth dry. The salt line stayed another minute. Then it dissolved into the air without a trace, like breath on a mirror. The pickup rolled forward, past me slow. The driver, a man my father's age, looked at the road, not me. I only caught his profile, the crease from nose to mouth like a scar. The white of his hair caught at his neck. He lifted his hand a finger's width, a blessing he didn't claim as such, and drove on. I made my deliveries. The surf hammered the sand with that flat boom it has by chachalakas. People swore the fish would come in heavy next morning. Above the palapas, the sky had a bruise where lightning walked without thunder. On my last trip back, at the palm clump, the candles for the drowned had 3 new glasses. The salt crusted on them in lace. I parked and looked at the road. I didn't see a line. I did see, far down the shoulder, A woman in a skirt to her ankles stoop and place something on the ground on one side of the asphalt, then raise her eyes to the other side as if measuring a seam. She stood, her braid heavy down her back, and waited. She waited until I drove away. If you see a salt line pulled tight across a coastal road, don't step over thinking you can get back what's behind it faster. The sea keeps what it keeps. Go around if you can, or wait. That's my word, Senor Williams. Now, let's move on. I know someone else is out there holding a story in their teeth. Procession under the volcano. Good night, Senor Williams, and good night to everyone who has made this community a place to unload without shame. My name is Alma. I'm a teacher in San Juan Tepanahuac up in Milpa Alta, where the city fades into milpas and the nights smell like damp adobe and wood smoke. I had listened for years without daring to write. This month, a boy from my class brought a cassette player for a project, and the tape inside had a hymn I hadn't heard since my grandmother's wake. That sound unlocked something. I need to put it somewhere that will not answer me back. Please turn off the light. Light brings me back to it too fast. I don't drive much at night. The roads up here are stone and slope and roots, and I love my old bocho too much to punish it. But the municipal office called to say a parent meeting had moved to evening to match people's work hours, and I stayed late. I left past 10. The air had that clean bitterness it gets after a small rain, the kind that only wets the skin of the earth and leaves the smell of wet dust. By San Pablo Ostotepec, El Volcan, always there without being there, glowed with the city's orange at his feet like a sleeping animal. I took the narrow callejón that meets the old road at a chapel. That chapel's door stays shut most nights, but people tie ribbons to its handles and slip prayers under the threshold. The bocho's engine hummed like a sewing machine, a sound that usually comforts me. The headlights found another car's taillights ahead, and I relaxed. There's safety in following a stranger's red. But those lights didn't move. The car was just far enough that I could not make out its model. Just 2 circles of red in a trunk line. I idled behind it and waited. No one honked. No one leaned out a window to ask what the hell. The street smelled like nopales boiled wrong and copal, like fiesta scent left backstage. From the chapel's side yard came a line of people, not many, 10 perhaps, all dressed in dark, not church dark, not black suits. Their clothes looked home-sewn, thick, the kind that could be hung without a hanger and keep its shape. Each held a candle in a glass. The glass was smoky, the flame steady without being bright. They moved not down the sidewalk but across the street, from the chapel door to a narrow alley that ends in a wall. They walked slow and did not look around. Their feet were sure on the stones. A woman at the front had a shawl over her head and pressed the glass of her candle to her chest. The way she cradled it was the way my grandmother had cradled my head when I was sick as a child. We waited. I could hear the breath of my engine. I could hear "This is what makes my mouth go dry even now." The fading sound of a rosary from a radio not tuned in, as if someone had placed a portable at the foot of the volcano, and the wind brought it to us half erased. I lowered my window to listen better, and the air that came in was colder than it had any right to be. I saw that the red taillights ahead of me, the ones I had thought were a car, were not fixed to any body. They were circles in the air, held at exactly the height a small Nissan would have them. And they did not throw light on the stones. They hovered with that patience a person has when holding back tears. My bocho coughed and died. The lights stayed on because they always do in that old wiring. I turned the key and it clicked hollow. I turned it again, and the key felt like I was stirring molasses. The procession reached the alley mouth and entered it as if the wall at its end were a door I couldn't see. The shawled woman lifted her candle once in both hands. an emotion that had nothing to do with me and everything to do with someone who wasn't there. A man at the back carried a wooden box the size of a bread loaf. He held it under his arm, the way men hold anything that matters when they want to pretend it doesn't. I thought about my grandmother's wake in San Antonio Tecomito, the smell of tamales and paraffin, the feel of my mother's palm damp in mine. I thought of the night we carried the cross to the cemetery in a drizzle, our breath white, the street slick. The Bocho's dashboard clock stopped at 10:12. Drops of water on the windshield from the earlier rain didn't slide. They stayed like a beaded curtain. A neighbor I recognized came up the stairs of a house on the right, one I hadn't seen open in years. Doña Petra walked with her hand on the wall, as she always did when her knees hurt, but the wall held her hand without letting it move. She was a sculpture with breath you couldn't see. I called to her, "Doña," and my voice laid itself on the stones like cloth. She did not turn. A dog on a roof made the first half of a bark and held it in his throat like a stone he hadn't decided to swallow. The red circles that were not taillights went out, and the dark behind the procession became the kind you feel like a hand closing. The last person stepped into the alley, and the alley swallowed them. The Bocho started by itself. I drove home in first gear. The radio, which hadn't worked in years, picked up a hymn I could hum in my sleep. At my door, the neighbor boy sat with a cassette player on his knees, flipping tapes with that care-only kids give dead technology. He played me the hymn I'd heard over the volcano and said his grandmother taught it to him. She died the year I started teaching. Sometimes going to school in the morning, I pass the chapel and the wall at the alley and see nothing but the stone a mason set there, his trowel marks still visible where the cement wanted to spill. Other mornings, when mist sits low and the smell of copal rides the cool, the mortar between those stones goes darker, as if wet from the other side. If you meet a procession at a shut chapel and the road ahead grows patient, don't force your engine, don't honk. The mountain keeps time differently, and that's a kindness. That's my testimony, Senor Williams. We can continue with the next story. I'll be listening with my window barely open. Dust check at Sabinas. Good night, Senor Williams, and good night to the friends here. My name is Hector. I'm an EMT out of Monclova, Coahuila. I do nights. People in towns like ours call when the mines spit rock or when the ranch roads decide to take their due. I listened for months because I keep enough of other people's nights in my head, but there's one I keep seeing when I try to close my eyes, and I can't do my work if I'm scared of the straight road. I need to leave it somewhere others will understand. Turn off your light, or if you're on duty, lower it. Let the siren sleep. We had a transfer to Piedras Negras, a heart case with an old man whose daughters had hands like rope from tying calves and holding back grief. We took the Libre through Sabinas because the Quota had a wreck the radio couldn't stop talking about. The air was still, that cold that only has taste after the sun has gone, holding the fingernail dirt that comes under the doors of every house. As we passed the edge of town, a dust devil met us nose on, thin, angry, and then gone. It left a powder smell like talc on a baby that you don't use anymore, but older women still do. We ran steady. The old man's heart ticked on the monitor in those green steps that feel like a promise until they don't. The driver, Martin, had that two-finger grip he gets when he's trying not to think of his own father. I watched the numbers and the numbers' shadows. The radio gave us rancheras about men who never learned, and then a burst of crosstalk from a mind shift. When the checkpoint appeared, it felt like it had risen out of the asphalt. 2 cones, faded orange turned chalk. A rope hung between 2 sawhorses. A small sign that said revision in black letters. The paint bubbled like it had been cooked under a heat that wasn't from this month. A soldier's booth, metal, with the door open. The light inside the booth was the kind of yellow you get from bulbs that belong in kitchens that haven't been changed in years. A soldier stood by the rope. He wore a uniform the color of dust and a helmet that was almost green. He lifted his hand, palm towards us. Martin slowed to a roll and then a stop that made the stretcher straps whisper. The soldier didn't look at us. He looked past us, the way people do when they are watching a line behind you. He raised the rope a little and then set it back. His other hand held the edge of the sawhorse so gently it made my eyes sting. His skin was the color of men who work outdoors until they sleep. He didn't speak. He didn't move his mouth. He was not a kid, not an old man. He was the age of this road. Our old man on the stretcher breathed the way engines do when they have a bubble in the line. In my ear, the monitor's beep stretched and then thinned until it was almost a thread you could pull and unravel the whole night. The dust devil smell returned, but without wind. Martin said, "Buenas?" because you don't not greet. The soldier didn't answer. He lifted his hand an inch higher and we understood not to pass. The air outside went granular. Like you could chew it, the road ahead lost its glare and turned into a photograph. Left of the booth, I saw another soldier step from behind it without stepping. Boot mid-air, sole dusty. His hand holding a clipboard whose paper had the shape of sweat on it. He didn't finish stepping. He held. Somewhere behind us, a truck braked with an air scream that never fell into quiet. The old man's daughters in the back held his hands and prayed in a murmur that turned to a wash, then to a hum, then to a tone. One daughter had coffee on her breath. The other had mint from a gum she was refusing to chew so as not to seem disrespectful. A third soldier was visible in the booth, taking off his helmet by the strap. He did not finish that either. He froze with the helmet just over his temple, as a father about to remove his hat at a church door. His knuckles were white. His hair showed a dent from long hours. The bulb above his head was a sun the size of a lemon. The dust hanging in its light didn't move. I thought, there must have been a moment here that did not pass. There must have been a second that forgot how to fall. And the road, loyal to itself, keeps honoring that second every so often, setting down the cones and the rope, and the men like a moth laying eggs at the same porch light. Martin reached for the siren switch, maybe to warn whoever could move that we had reason, that the heart in our little box was writing thinner lines. His hand moved like someone else's underwater. He set it back. He looked at me and I saw a boy who once tried to hold his breath past the count of 30 behind the school. He shook his head. We waited. The daughters cried without sound. The soldier in front of us dropped his hand, not quickly, not in a gesture he chose. Gravity remembered itself. The rope lifted a finger's width and then lowered and then wasn't there. We drove. We didn't gun it. Martin has pride in smoothness. We passed the booth. I looked inside because I am a man who needs to know. On the desk was a photograph in a frame. Its glass was cracked. The crack ran through the cheek of a woman who wore her hair the way women did when my mother was my age. Next to the photograph was a cup of coffee in a white enamel mug with a blue rim. A fly was there and not there over it. There was a list of names. There was a small plastic virgin so old her face had become a blur of patience. Her eyes looked down in a direction that made my stomach try to step off the ambulance. By the time we reached the junction, the monitor had found its voice again. We delivered the old man to a hospital whose walls smelled of bleach and dried tears. In the morning, when we returned, we took the same road. There was no checkpoint. The cones were in a pile at a Pemex a kilometer away. The booth's patch of dirt had a rectangle of darker dust. I asked around, not because I was brave, but because some part of my head insisted on inventory. An older paramedic told me there had been a checkpoint out there in the early 90s after a mine protest turned into something worse. He said a storm came, the road washed, people said time hiccuped, and after that, every few years the cones showed up when they had no business to, and the right men held the rope without speaking. He said you learned to wait. He said nobody who honked got what they wanted. If you find a rope across a straight road where there shouldn't be one, if a man in dust-colored clothes raises his palm, don't ask. Don't push your seconds against his. Wait for yours to start again. We're alive because we respect procedures, even the ones the road makes up. That's my testimony. And now, let the next one through. I'll ride in the back and listen. The green bus that never crossed. Good night, Senor Williams, and everyone listening in half-dark kitchens and parked trucks. I'm Even, from Ocotlan, Jalisco. I tune in when I'm cleaning the small restaurant my wife and I run because the hissing of the fryer and the voice of the night help me have a spine. I write now because for 3 years I avoided the tracks by the old sugar warehouse. Then I heard a man here talk about a train whistle that stretched like a thread, and I felt my chest unclench just enough to try. Please lower your lights. This is not a story about ghosts with words. It's about a moment that opened like a jaw and never closed all the way. The crossing sits by the warehouse, a building that smells in summer like the inside of a brown bag, sweet and damp. The tracks see one freight a day now, if that. Most of the time there are only the dogs that sleep there because the gravel holds heat late. I was bringing tortillas to the taqueria near the market, fresh at 4 a.m., that hour when even the roosters are thinking about it but haven't begun. The cold was the kind that nips your fingers and makes the plastic of the tortilla packs squeak. The town was all off-white. The basil in people's doorways had gone black with night. As I rolled toward the tracks, a green bus from the other side came into view. The old kind, with the paint dulled by sun. No route sign, no ad on the side. The windows were open even in that cold. Inside, people sat too upright, hands in their laps like in a school picture. A girl near the back held the strap of a backpack with both fists. A man near the front had a hat on his knees and looked down at it as if it were a small animal he didn't want to wake. Their faces were there, and not there in the windshield reflections. No one looked at me. No one took a breath big enough to fog the glass. The signal lights at the crossing began to blink. The bell struck the side of my head once. I put my foot on the brake. The bus rolled slower, slower. It came to a stop with its front tire kissing the first rail. No train was visible. The bell did not strike again. My entire body felt like the instant after a sneeze that never came. From the warehouse yard, a man in overalls walked toward the bus with a flag folded under his arm. He set his boot on the gravel, and that boot stayed there mid-step, a centimeter of heel off the ground. He did not sway, he did not blink. The flag's corner lifted in air that wasn't moving. A thin ribbon of steam from the bus's exhaust hung like a rope. The plastic in my hands stopped squeaking because my hands had stopped. I could move if I wanted to, but moving would be like pushing through those clear curtains they hang in cold rooms. Possible. Wrong. Light slid across the scene from the corner of my eye in a direction that had no source. It picked out the bus's rivets and made of each a dot that hurt. The crossbuck sign over the tracks leaned without leaning. Sound became a smear. The bell's first strike stretched across my teeth and never finished. In that smear, other sounds swam. The catches of coughs, a shoe scuff, the smallest click of a tongue. The bus driver's hands were at 10 and 2, the knuckles too white. I thought of the day my father took me to Guadalajara to ride a train for the first and last time, how the platform smelled like hot iron and orange peels, how the train stood too long and then left too fast, and how time that day was a rubber band I couldn't control. I thought of the night my daughter had a fever, and the minute hand on the clock moved only when I looked away. On the sidewalk, a small boy held his mother's skirt. He had a toy in his other hand, a plastic dinosaur. He had bitten one corner of it and the teeth marks made a scallop on its tail. He lifted the dinosaur, slow as moss grows, toward the bus window where the girl with the backpack sat. She turned her face a degree, the smallest, and the skin under her eye caught the light in a way that made it a different person. Her lips parted to say something. Nothing came. I set the tortillas on the seat next to me because my hands had decided that if they were going to shake, they wouldn't drop what feeds us. I put my palm on the dashboard. The plastic was warm from the engine and dry from the air and felt like touching someone's shoulder when they are trying not to cry. I said, "Yeah," to no one. I said, yeah, like the way my grandmother did ending prayers. And then time landed. The bus engine coughed, a real cough. The bell finished its second strike and then the third, and then the red lights stopped. The man with the flag finished his step, glanced up without seeing me, and unfolded the yellow to wave twice for a train that didn't arrive, and then folded it again with the care of someone who has done this 1,000 days. The bus rolled back an inch, as if the driver had been holding it with his foot and remembered not to. He looked to his left and right like a man trying a lock he doesn't own. He drove over the rails and didn't look at me. I crossed after him. The warehouse breathed out and smelled like sugar burned on purpose, the caramel catching in my nose. The boy with the dinosaur walked with his mother, and the dinosaur's tail had no bite marks. My stomach went cold and hot because I had to decide whether that was a different toy or a different boy or a different minute that had been given back without teeth marks. For months, I took the longer way. When I had to return, I returned with the speed of a person coming to a grave. I don't play with the signal if it blinks without a train. I stop and I wait for the second that belongs to me. If a bus waits with people too still, I lower my eyes. I've learned there are scenes the town rehearses when no one is watching. We look at the result and call it life. Don't force your crossing. If your bell only hits once, count without numbers. Let the second land when it's ready. That's what I learned. That's my story. Fire that waits in the mix. Good night, Senor Williams. Good night, community. I'm Benjamin.